We start tonight by easing into the solemn, echoing stone passages of a medieval fortress. Torches cast dancing light along these ancient surfaces, and you can almost perceive the quiet, thin whistle of the wind as it seeks out tiny crevices in the massive wooden doors. This atmosphere feels wholly romantic when viewed casually as a visitor. Yet, if you were compelled to reside here, particularly on a biting winter's evening, your sense of wonder would surely dissipate within the first hour. The simple, unvarnished truth remains: castles were profoundly cold. To sleep within one, devoid of the benefits of central heating, the protection of insulated glass, or even a truly comfortable mattress by contemporary metrics, would be to rapidly discover your true adversary wasn't a rival knight at all. It was the chilling, pervasive cold. You'd likely not endure this without cultivating specific hard-won survival methods. So before you allow yourself to sink further into this atmosphere, please consider lending your support by liking this presentation and subscribing, but only if you genuinely appreciate the immersive journeys we craft here. And if you are listening now, in this very moment, gently share your location and the local time within the comments below. I always enjoy seeing precisely where in the world our listeners are tuning in from. Now, intentionally lower the surrounding light. Let your rhythm of breathing deepen and slow, and visualize yourself making preparations for rest inside a colossal medieval stronghold. You take heavy steps across the flagstone floor of a vast chamber, your boots gently grinding on material worn smooth over countless years, and by generations of feet. The cold sensation bites at your skin immediately, even though your body is entirely concealed by layers of clothing. The immense stone walls do not merely resist the infusion of warmth, they seem to actively consume it whole. Historians frequently honor these castles as magnificent marvels of defense, though seldom do they celebrate them as marvels of genuine comfort. And here lies the difficult, blunt reality: those same immensely thick walls, engineered to resist the powerful impact of a battering ram, also functioned to trap cold air inside, effectively operating as a monumental refrigerator. As soon as the afternoon sun finally disappeared, the temperature inside would plummet, mirroring the rapid decline of the external world. You would surely observe your own breath condensing into clouds suspended right before your face. The internal air felt heavy, perpetually damp, and utterly unwelcoming. Castles were specifically engineered to exclude enemies, not to maintain a comfortable temperature. The original architects meticulously factored in moats, drawbridges, and narrow arrow slits, but the concept of genuine insulation was never truly featured in their foundational blueprints. A foundational fact to remember is that a large number of castles constructed throughout northern Europe were intentionally sited on exposed, wind-scoured hilltops. From a pragmatic military standpoint, this was unquestionably a brilliant strategy. It allowed for the early detection of advancing invading forces, and the elevated slopes provided a distinct defensive tactical advantage. From the weary perspective of any individual merely seeking restorative sleep, however, this placement was an absolute curse. The constant wind perpetually scoured every surface, mercilessly forcing icy drafts through tiny concealed gaps in shutters and beneath the heavy chamber doors. You could not possibly have sought out a worse sleeping environment, even if you had specifically engineered it yourself. One might naively believe that the numerous fireplaces could offer salvation, but alas, this was simply not the case. Even a fiercely roaring fire situated within the enormous Great Hall would manage to barely warm the limited, immediate radius around its perimeter. And the further you were compelled to move away from those intense, flickering flames, the more immediate and profound the cold became. By the time your shuffling steps finally carried you toward your modest bedchamber, the actual temperature there could easily feel more akin to a subterranean stone cellar than an actual functioning living space. Now, consider this rather unusual historical quirky tidbit. In several preserved documents from the later medieval period, traveling visitors wrote with genuine shock about encountering frost naturally forming inside the enclosed bedrooms of various castles. Imagine the unsettling experience of being roused in the morning, only to find small icicles hanging down from your elaborate bed curtains, or discovering that your personal wash basin containing water had completely frozen solid during the long night. Chroniclers of the time treated this profound reality as almost entirely normal, often deeming it not worthy of anything more than a single passing mention. If your personal chamber did not develop a thin, visible layer of rime along its stone walls throughout the month of January, you were unquestionably in the distinct minority. And yet, Despite the relentless chill, people still managed to survive. They somehow developed clever, intuitive ways to prevent their living bodies from becoming literal human popsicles. A significant part of this intense survival instinct involved the establishment of consistent nightly ritual. As the darkness of night began to fall, entire castle households would collectively adhere to specific patterns explicitly meant to capture and trap any warmth that could be salvaged. The castle structure itself might be vast and intimidating, but the singular focus invariably narrowed to shrinking the actual living space once darkness fell. The open fires were systematically banked down, individual beds were intentionally arranged with surrounding heavy curtains, multiple layers of clothing were worn until physical mobility became only a secondary concern, and everyone held a silent, collective hope that the inevitable draft wouldn't prove too profoundly cruel. You vividly picture yourself entering a typical medieval bedchamber. The bed itself appears as an incredibly impressive piece of intricate carpentry, intentionally built and raised quite high above the floor. That specific elevation wasn't chosen for a decorative style. It was, instead, a tactical strategy to escape the coldest, densest layer of air, which always naturally sinks lower. Even despite this elevation, the surrounding stone perpetually radiates a chill upward, a sensation your body immediately registers the precise moment you climb beneath the numerous covers. Historians still debate whether the experience of living in castles truly grew any more comfortable as the passing centuries accumulated, or whether the enduring myths of a cozy, noble existence were simply over-embellished by later generations of storytellers. Some posited that decorative tapestries and thick draperies genuinely had the power to transform chilly rooms into noticeably warmer personal spaces. Others adamantly insist that the overwhelming cold always prevailed, regardless of the sheer volume of fabric intentionally hung upon the exposed walls. The likely truth probably resides somewhere in the middle of this debate. Conditions certainly did improve somewhat over time, but never to the true elevated level of modern comfort. You finally settle back into this visualized bed, the heavy wooden frame creaking softly as the straw-stuffed bedding gently rustles beneath your body. Outside the window, the wind emits a low moan as it violently scrapes against the battlements. The only meager illumination available comes from a small oil lamp, visibly guttering near the bedside, and even this struggling flame feels as though it is desperately fighting just to stay alive. Your toes already begin to ache with the immediate sharp cold, even though you are still encased within your layered daytime clothes. And then, the unmistakable sounds of a sleeping castle night begin to subtly filter in. The distant, faint echo of boots on stone as a solitary guard changes his watch. The heavy creak of rafters contracting under the accumulated frost. A dog barks faintly within the deep courtyard, its voice profoundly muffled by the sheer thickness of the surrounding walls. You might even clearly perceive the drip of water as it instantly freezes somewhere very near to you. None of these omnipresent sounds help you feel even slightly warmer. Instead, every single sound serves as a potent reminder that the world outside your bed is utterly unforgiving. It's tempting, and perhaps easier, to picture the nobility snuggled in perfect comfort, while the impoverished peasants froze within their simple cottages. But here, the situation offers an odd irony. Sometimes the peasants actually experienced a superior situation. Their humble homes, deliberately built of sturdy wood and daub, possessed the capacity to trap the valuable heat from their central hearth, far more efficiently than the vast cavernous chambers of a lord's keep. A single, modest fire burning inside a small enclosed hut could successfully maintain a decent level of warmth for an entire family. Meanwhile, you, as a privileged noble in a castle, might be forced to shiver uncontrollably inside an enormous stone box, a space so colossal that even 5 fiercely roaring fireplaces could not manage to make a noticeable dent in the temperature. That palpable irony was certainly not lost upon the contemporaries of the time. A few surviving letters from visiting clerics and noble guests openly remark upon the difficulty they experienced achieving truly restful sleep in various castles during the heart of winter. They consistently describe the beds as outwardly grand, but the accompanying nights as bitterly cold. Some authors even went so far as to advise fellow travelers to pack extra cloaks, not for any ostentatious display, but for the fundamental necessity of survival. As you intentionally continue to picture yourself lying there in the heavy bed, you begin to truly appreciate the incredible ingenuity it must have required just to successfully get through a single night. You didn't just carelessly crawl under a singular blanket and merely hope for the best outcome. You meticulously layered numerous fabrics, carefully stacked thick furs, consciously pulled bed curtains tight, and sometimes even intentionally shared your bed with companions, whether they were human or otherwise. Every deliberate step taken was fundamentally about the crucial process of creating microclimates, small, concentrated zones of warmth within a vast, harsh environment, explicitly engineered by nature and architecture to be relentlessly and profoundly cold. The overall experience fundamentally reshapes your understanding of daily medieval life. These historical individuals were not solely warriors and powerful lords, devoted monks and noble maidens. They were, first and foremost, dedicated survivalists. Every single bedtime represented a difficult test. Every winter presented a relentless trial, and the act of sleep, which we now often perceive as an effortless luxury, had to be painstakingly engineered and secured through complex rituals, passed down across multiple generations. Imagine the depth of gratitude you would have felt for every tiny flicker of warmth, the sudden deep comfort of a loyal dog warmly pressed against your aching feet, the intense thrill of hot stones deliberately placed very near your bedding, the tiny, crucial victory of successfully preventing frost from forming on your beard throughout the entire night. These deeply personal moments would unquestionably stay with you far more vividly than any elaborate banquet or organized hunt. Simple, hard-won survival was truly memorable. So tonight, as your body is safely enveloped within your modern bed, accompanied by the gentle humming of your central heating system, you can afford to spare a compassionate thought for those historical figures who once lay uncontrollably shivering inside immense stone chambers. Their nights were perpetually long, their mornings invariably bitter, and yet they persevered. They found ingenious ways to finally achieve sleep in places that by modern standards should have been utterly uninhabitable. That incredible fundamental ingenuity is precisely what we will continue to explore layer by methodical layer, discovering trick by survival trick, as this profound story gently carries you deeper into the medieval night. You now step into the Great Hall, the undisputed beating heart of any working medieval castle. If the isolated bedchamber felt like a silent tomb of draughts and cold stone, this specific area, at the very least, actively alive with numerous flickers of warmth. Long, sturdy trestle tables stretch across the whole floor, their wooden surfaces notably polished smooth by countless weary elbows and heavy tankards. The heavy air carries the rich, commingled smells of roasted meat, spilled ale, damp wool, and persistent smoke that never seems to fully dissipate from the towering rafters. The immense fire roaring inside the central hearth burns brightly, a strong, defiant square of intense orange heat, pushing back against the encroaching winter darkness. This is the single space where the castle truly felt most alive after the sun disappeared. People naturally gathered here, not exclusively for communal food, but also to purposefully absorb as much warmth as humanly possible before their reluctant retreat to their individual icy chambers. Servants dart back and forth constantly, carrying heavily loaded trenchers of bread, numerous jugs of ale, and great steaming platters of pottage. Dogs scavenge playfully underfoot, their tails wagging expectantly, hoping to secure scraps. The hall is typically loud, almost boisterous, filled with the sound of collective laughter, spontaneous song, and the persistent clattering of knives against metal plates. For a precious, fleeting time, you can temporarily forget that outside the enormous structure, the wind howls mercilessly across the battlements, and heavy frost is visibly forming on the window ledges. Here is the undeniable plain truth. The Great Hall was arguably the only space within the majority of castles where dedicated heating was even remotely successful in its function. A truly huge open hearth physically dominated the center or one end of the massive room, and its fire was purposefully fed almost constantly throughout the entire winter season. Logs, sometimes enormous ones that felt like entire tree trunks, were continuously hauled in just to keep the fire actively going. If you possessed a respectable rank, you quickly claimed a seat nearest to it, basking comfortably in that intense golden glow, while various servants or less fortunate souls shivered noticeably along the outer edges. But here existed the essential catch. Even within this magnificent grand room, the effective heat only traveled so far. The further you were situated from the active flames, the more immediately cold the ambient air became, until it felt as though the very walls themselves were breathing out a frost. The available heat rose directly upward, frustratingly trapped inside the smoke-stained rafters, while those unfortunate individuals situated on the floor wrapped themselves tightly in thick cloaks and continuously huddled together. In truth, only a lucky few ever managed to feel truly warm, and everyone else simply pretended to be. One quirky tidbit that various chroniclers frequently mention is that formal feasts sometimes effectively doubled as strategic heating sessions. Nobles intentionally scheduled their largest gatherings during the most bitter months, fully knowing that the immense body heat of hundreds of guests combined with the large fire would successfully transform the great hall into something at least approaching cozy. In some fascinating accounts, it is even said that servants were specifically instructed to stand closer together simply to generate extra warmth. You could easily argue that the ritual of feasting was as much about communal survival as it was about collective merrymaking. But the intense glow of the hall never managed to last forever. When the large feast slowly began to wind down, the various minstrels carefully packed away their delicate instruments, and the remaining guests reluctantly staggered off toward their individual beds. The enormous fire was eventually allowed to burn down low. Embers glowed red, serving as a final, last stand against the invading cold, and shadows began to grow incredibly long upon the stone walls. That crucial heat you had desperately clung to during the evening hours rapidly dissipated. Within a mere hour or two, the great hall itself would unfortunately fall back into a frigid, profound silence. Visualize yourself right now. You are purposefully lingering near the dying fire, completely unwilling to leave, consciously stretching your hands to soak up every last, dwindling spark of warmth. Your exposed cheeks glow hot, but the entire back of your body already registers the cold creeping in, urgently reminding you of what waits upstairs. The lingering smoke stings your eyes and persistently clings to your hair, but you still deeply dread the moment when you must finally climb the spiral staircase toward your isolated chamber. Historians still actively debate whether some castles ever truly developed any more sophisticated heating systems specifically for their great halls. A few scholars vigorously argue that carefully placed vents and flues allowed the precious warmth to circulate, particularly in the later centuries. Others strongly suggest this is little more than wishful thinking, meticulously pointing out that traditional medieval building technology simply did not prioritize comfort. The consensus of opinion tends to lean toward the harsher truth. The Great Hall was only truly warm in the immediate vicinity of the fire, and nowhere else. Even the room's vast acoustics served as a constant reminder that this was not a cozy lodge, but a large, cavernous chamber of power. Every spontaneous laugh echoed, every soft footstep amplified, until the entire soundscape itself seemed overwhelmingly too large, too cold. And when the hall finally emptied, the silence became incredibly oppressive, like the profound quiet of sitting deep inside the belly of a sleeping giant. One of the most truly telling images is the profound transition itself. The reluctant walk from the great hall up to your bedchamber. Picture vividly leaving the intense golden firelight. You step into a narrow passage, minimally lit by a solitary torch. The draft hits you instantly. A truly sharp knife of cold air rapidly rushing through exposed arrow slits and unsealed doorways. The warmth you had just carried within your very bones drains away completely, as though the castle itself is actively feeding on it. That abrupt shift from one room of temporary comfort to the endless biting chill beyond was the defining feature of daily medieval nights. Sometimes, noble residents intentionally lingered so long within the great hall that they would practically sleep right there. A high-backed bench pulled incredibly close to the central hearth could successfully serve as a makeshift bed, and numerous servants or dedicated guards often simply collapsed near the embers rather than face their isolated chambers. To intentionally sleep near the fire meant a willingness to risk sparks, smoke, and the presence of restless noise, but compared to the freezing icy stone above, it was still a deeply tempting alternative. Another curious note gleaned from surviving records. Traveling guests frequently complained more about the journey from the Great Hall to the sleeping quarters than they did about the sleep itself. That brief, sudden exposure, the transition of moving directly from intense warmth into profound cold, was consistently described as a brutal shock to the human body. People openly spoke of experiencing intense shivers that lasted the entire night specifically because of that short walk. It's almost as if the castle itself was deliberately punishing you for daring to even think you might be comfortable. The gradual fading glow of the hall also carried a crucial psychological weight. You intrinsically knew that once you finally left it behind, the ensuing night would be long and utterly merciless. The Great Hall was more than just a room. It represented a fundamental ritual, a vital gathering of warmth before the unavoidable surrender to the overwhelming cold. Every torch intentionally put out, every communal cup drained, was yet another deliberate step toward a predicted shivering ordeal in bed. Even when viewed within the faint flicker of a candlelight, you profoundly sense how temporary comfort really was. The fire that previously roared now only whispers faintly, small sparks popping and quickly dying. A reluctant servant pokes at it half-heartedly, then finally gives up, consciously leaving the embers to slowly fade. The intense sound of laughter and feasting is gone, purposefully replaced by the quiet groans of the immense castle structure settling into the night. And so, you reluctantly turn to begin climbing that staircase, your thick cloak wrapped tightly around your body, the comforting memory of warmth fading with your every upward step. The intense glow of the great hall lingers vividly in your mind, like a comforting dream you deeply wish could somehow last. But already, your toes begin to feel numb, your fingers start to sting, and you abruptly realize that the rest of the night will be a desperate, ongoing fight for crucial heat. That crucial, fleeting glow is ultimately what successfully kept people sane. The ritual of gathering, feasting, and deeply basking in the firelight before the inevitable cold reclaimed its territory. Without the great hall, the castle would have been utterly unbearable. With it, historical individuals at least had a fighting chance to remember what true warmth felt like, even if only for a few short hours. You continue to climb higher into the keep now, moving further away from the fading glow of the great hall, and the surrounding air changes immediately. The previous warmth of the fire is utterly gone, intentionally replaced by a damp cold that persistently clings to your bones. The walls are extraordinarily thick, thicker than anything you have ever observed inside modern houses. Sometimes the stone measured up to 12 feet in width, a veritable wall separating you completely from the external world. Initially, that sounds fundamentally like true protection. But here is the profound irony. Those very walls that could successfully stop arrows and siege engines also effectively trapped the persistent chill inside. If you have ever intentionally stepped into a basement during the dead of winter, you immediately know the sensation. The stone holds the temperature like a deep memory, perpetually radiating cold, even when the outside air temporarily warms briefly. Medieval builders fundamentally understood strength and permanence, but sadly not comfort, and thus the immense walls eventually became deeply paradoxical. They functioned as strong fortresses against men, but proved wholly ineffective against the weather. One specific fact historians universally agree on is that castles rarely ever managed to warm beyond a narrow radius surrounding the hearth. A fire would fiercely blaze, smoke would continuously curl upward, but step only 10 feet away, and you were unfortunately already back inside an icebox. Written accounts meticulously preserved from the 13th and 14th centuries consistently describe noble families intentionally sitting directly in front of the active flames. Cloaks were pulled entirely over their heads, while positioned right behind them, various servants would ceaselessly stamp their feet in an attempt to maintain vital circulation. The fire successfully created a fragile bubble of tolerable heat, but the surrounding stone refused to yield. Now, a fascinating curious note from numerous travelers' journals. Some authors specifically complained that the walls themselves perpetually sweated. Moisture would rapidly condense on the incredibly cold stone and run down in persistent streaks, rendering chambers damp and unpleasant. Imagine the chilling reality of lying in bed and constantly hearing tiny drips hitting the floor right beside you for the entire night. Not precisely the lullaby you might have desired. In some particular seasons, actual moss even grew upon the interior surfaces. So yes, you did technically live inside a castle, but at certain times, it profoundly resembled more of a natural cave. Modern scholars still consistently wrestle with the question of whether tapestries and thick hangings truly managed to make much difference. We visually picture grand walls entirely lined with richly woven cloth. But did those immense thick fabrics truly insulate the room, or did they merely serve an elaborate decorative purpose? Some meticulous researchers argue they noticeably cut drafts, successfully creating crucial pockets of warmth right behind the drapery. Others forcefully think this was exaggerated in later, highly romanticized depictions, precisely pointing out that even the most substantial, richest cloth could never successfully compete with freezing air intentionally filtering through unglazed windows and tiny door cracks. The debate regrettably lingers unresolved, but it clearly tells you one crucial thing. Historical people were truly desperate enough to try almost anything they could conceive of. So, deliberately picture it now. You intentionally enter a bedchamber in late January. The fire in the hearth is small, perhaps already guttering. The towering walls rise like immense cliffs all around you, their cold surface slick with condensation. Even fully wrapped in multiple layers of wool, you visibly shiver. The imposing bed stands proud right in the center, heavy curtains intentionally drawn all around it. Behind those crucial curtains, the air might feel a few degrees warmer, a small, isolated little cocoon carved out of the cold, but outside of them, the entire chamber feels like a stone tomb. The intense psychological effect was arguably just as severe. People openly wrote about dreading the cold more than chronic hunger or even illness. At the very least, hunger and illness eventually passed. The cold was utterly relentless, every single night of the entire winter season. When you continuously lived in a castle, you simply couldn't escape it. That chilling sense of profound imprisonment right within your own home definitely left its mark. You now vividly imagine lying there, purposefully pulling the coverlet tight, intently listening to the hiss of wind aggressively sneaking through arrow slits. Your exposed ears burn with cold. Your fingers stiffen. Even your dreams, when they finally come, are often profoundly haunted by images of ice and fire. The immense stone walls surround you not at all like a comforting protective shield, but more like a perpetual refrigerator that never switches off. And here is where your entire perspective subtly shifts. Castles were never fundamentally glamorous in daily life. They served as effective survival machines, yes, but they deliberately made you pay a price for that essential protection. Personal comfort was inevitably sacrificed for security, and every single winter's night constantly reminded you that the harsh stone might successfully keep you safe from arrows, but it would absolutely never keep you warm. The more you truly think about it, the clearer it completely becomes. Sleeping in a medieval castle was inherently less about successfully resting peacefully, and far more about meticulously staging a small, nightly war against the unforgiving environment. The enemy was invisible but utterly merciless. And the specific battlefield was perpetually the exact same. Your chamber, your bed, your body. You shuffle across the chamber floor, and instead of plush carpets or polished wood, your heavy boots crunch gently against something far humbler, rushes intentionally strewn across the stone. These humble materials were not purely decoration. They were, in fact, a deeply practical attempt to intentionally soften the cold beneath your feet, efficiently soak up spills, and most importantly, successfully act as a crude form of crucial insulation. Documents meticulously preserved from the later Middle Ages vividly describe how castle households actively renewed the rushes a few times each year, purposefully layering them thick inside noble halls and sleeping chambers. When they were freshly laid down, they emitted a pleasant, faint smell of the outdoors, grassy, earthy, almost comforting. For a brief, fleeting moment, you might even feel as though a small part of summer had been successfully carried inside. The plant material intentionally added padding, effectively muffled footsteps, and fundamentally helped to hold in whatever little warmth could be trapped nearest to the ground. But the fleeting charm did not last. Over a short period of time, the rushes inevitably grew foul. Food scraps, spilled ale, and stray bones discarded from the feast deliberately lodged themselves within. Mice and various insects subsequently treated the floor as their personal playground. If you are visually picturing a cozy, natural carpet, you must think again. By the end of a long winter, the rushes could potentially be so filthy that one French moralist openly complained that sleeping was effectively like resting in a midden. What profoundly strikes you as fascinating is precisely how these rushes successfully worked double duty. Yes, they successfully trapped a thin layer of warmth, but they also successfully absorbed essential moisture directly from the incredibly damp stone. In a vast castle where profound condensation dripped constantly from the sheer walls, this absorption process truly mattered. Otherwise, every single step taken would have been across slick stone and dangerous puddles of freezing water. A peculiar aside appears in some surviving English household accounts. Herbs such as fragrant lavender, rosemary, or meadowsweet were occasionally sprinkled among the rushes. The underlying idea was partly practical. Strong-smelling plants successfully disguised the persistent odor emanating from rotting scraps, but it also successfully provided a small whiff of comfort in rooms otherwise thick with persistent smoke and dampness. Imagine finally settling into bed and catching a subtle faint note of lavender, successfully masked beneath the overwhelming scent of wet wool and wood smoke. It certainly wouldn't actively make you warmer, but it might indeed make the intense night just a little more bearable. There's an ongoing debate among architectural historians concerning exactly how effective these rushes truly were. Some argue they genuinely provided warmth by consciously creating an insulating mat between human feet and the incredibly icy stone. Others wholly dismiss them as largely symbolic gestures of basic order and cleanliness, precisely pointing out that the majority of the heat loss consistently came directly from the walls and ceilings. Anyway, the available evidence is noticeably patchy, and so the crucial question lingers. Were the rushes a genuine true medieval technology of warmth, or simply a messy habit disguised as tradition? You now vividly picture yourself lying in bed while a dedicated servant successfully finishes scattering new rushes across the entire chamber floor. They crunch softly underfoot, successfully releasing faint aromas as they are actively trampled down. For a very fleeting moment, the room perceptibly feels cleaner, almost civilized. But you intrinsically know that by morning the rushes will have already completely absorbed the dampness, and the natural cycle of decay will begin again. Think of the intense sensory overload associated with such a bedroom. Beneath your heavy sheets, you might feel the comforting texture of wool or fur. But persistently rising all around you is the musty smell of old rushes, the sharp tang of various herbs, and the omnipresent smoke clinging to your clothes. The floor rustles softly as various mice quickly scurry in their continuous search for crumbs. Every minute detail successfully reminds you that survival, not luxury, ultimately defined your sleep. Yet, there exists a profound kind of ingenuity embedded within it too. These historical people consciously used the simplest materials, plant life intentionally gathered from riverbanks and open fields, and successfully turned them into crucial tools for enduring the long, harsh winter. They didn't conceive of concepts like carpets or insulation. They intentionally thought in terms of whatever could keep the chill a fraction further away. So as you carefully rest your head in this vividly imagined chamber, you truly realize that even the floor beneath you was a fundamental part of the nightly battle against the cold. Stone was the clear enemy. Rushes served as a fragile shield. And every passing morning began with the crucial question: how long will it take until these two eventually betrayed you with dampness and inevitable decay? You now consciously sit on the edge of the bed, gently running your fingers across the layers of cloth, purposefully piled high. If there ever existed one crucial medieval survival secret against the relentless night chill, it was unquestionably fabric. Wool, linen and fur eventually became the crucial weapons of choice, meticulously wrapped and layered until you profoundly resembled a cocoon rather than a mere sleeper. Preserved records from historical household inventories clearly make it evident just how central textiles were to medieval life. Linen sheets were consistently considered the baseline, feeling smooth and cool against the skin, though fundamentally far less insulating than the subsequent layers placed on top. Over that initial layer came incredibly thick woolen blankets, often heavy enough that some people literally compared them to the weight of a hound. And if you possessed enough wealth, you subsequently added fur coverlets, crafted from fox, sable, or even durable bear pelts. Nobles intentionally invested fortunes into such high-quality bedding, not solely for outward show, but precisely because without it, winter nights could truly become lethal. But there exists an often amusing observation meticulously buried in the sources. Servants sometimes openly joked that their masters couldn't move once they were successfully tucked in. So many heavy layers pinned them down that the simple act of turning over required a genuine monumental effort. Imagine the challenge of being meticulously swaddled in 5 or 6 heavy blankets, so tightly tucked that you were forced to either lie perfectly still or risk entirely pulling the covers off and immediately freezing. Crucial warmth came at the direct cost of mobility, a trade-off most historical figures were completely willing to make. Fur genuinely deserves special attention. Beyond its perceived luxury, it was profoundly practical. Arctic fox pelts, marten skins, and thick sheepskin all successfully provided dense warmth. One persistent chronicler vividly describes a noble woman in Burgundy who outright refused to travel without her treasured ermine-lined bed covers, even during the heat of summer, explicitly because she feared catching chills during the night. To us, this behavior sounds entirely absurd, but in a profound age where relentless drafts slice through every room, intense paranoia about cold was entirely rational. A strange custom pops up consistently in certain households. Some historical people genuinely believed sleeping under too much linen was unhealthy because linen was wrongly thought to draw out the body's natural heat. To successfully balance this, they intentionally layered wool or fur both above and below, successfully creating what we might call a textile sandwich. The underlying idea was that linen cooled, wool heated, and fur successfully trapped it all in. Whether this underlying theory worked scientifically is doubtful, but it clearly shows how people intentionally mixed folklore with practical comfort. Scholars actively continue to puzzle over the profound social meaning of these textiles. Was fur truly about fundamental survival, or was it mostly a clear status signaling tool? On one hand, detailed inventories prove that wealthy nobles collected enormous numbers of fur coverlets. On the other hand, impoverished families successfully survived without them, entirely relying on coarse wool instead. Some dedicated historians argue that furs were primarily symbols of rank and power, while others actively maintain they were a crucial necessity inside drafty castles. The truth most likely sat somewhere in between. They functioned as both life-saving tools and markers of prestige. Now, vividly imagine yourself beneath these many layers. The wool itches faintly against your exposed skin, feeling rougher than modern textiles. Above that, the fur feels dense and almost suffocating, but at least it successfully keeps the cold at bay. The heavy blankets press you firmly into the straw mattress with their sheer weight. You shift, but only very slightly. Any larger movement would instantly invite icy air directly into the crucial cocoon. Your breath warms the small space around your face, while the entire rest of you relies entirely on the effective barrier of cloth. The profound silence of the room amplifies every sensation. The soft rustle of linen, the coarse scratch of wool, the faint, musky odor of animal pelts. There's something intensely intimate and primal about this situation. You are entirely wrapped in the skins and fibers of the natural world. Every single thread and hair serves as a potent reminder that survival fundamentally depends on turning the environment itself into protective armor. And embedded within that profound thought lies the very essence of medieval sleep. To successfully rest was to consciously build a fortress inside a fortress, not with imposing battlements and extensive moats, but with simple sheets and warm furs. Each passing night you deliberately barricaded yourself against the cold, using whatever quality textiles you could successfully muster. Without them, even the most magnificent castle chamber would profoundly feel like the inside of a crypt. So, as you lie there inside this vividly imagined cocoon, you begin to fully understand the nightly ritual. Gather layers, weigh yourself down, and simply hope they hold until morning. The cold might fiercely rattle the shutters, persistently creep through the stones, and aggressively swirl around your bed, but safely inside the fortress of fabric, you possessed a fighting chance. The bed itself was fundamentally more than a piece of furniture. It was a sophisticated machine, intentionally designed to create a small, livable climate inside an otherwise hostile room. When you intentionally draw back the heavy curtains of a medieval four-poster, you aren't just cautiously peeking into someone's private sleeping space. You are actively stepping into a micro-world explicitly built for survival. Detailed inventories meticulously collected from noble households clearly show how important these great beds truly were. Unlike the simple pallets utilized by peasants, these specific frames rose off the ground, often standing tall as a person, intricately carved from sturdy oak or walnut. The posts stood like solid pillars, frequently ornately decorated, and successfully stretched upward to support a canopy. That crucial canopy wasn't exclusively decorative, it was fundamentally practical. By purposefully draping curtains down along the sides, you effectively trapped your own body heat inside. It systematically turned an icy chamber into something faintly resembling warmth. Think of it almost like a medieval tent, intentionally pitched inside your bedroom. Once the surrounding curtains were successfully closed, the internal difference could be dramatic. The residual heat from your breath, from your body, from the numerous thick bedding layers, all collectively gathered within a drafty room where the ambient temperature might continuously hover just above freezing. Those crucial extra few degrees could easily mean the profound difference between a miserable night and one that was merely tolerable. There's an often cited record from a French duchess who actively traveled with her entire bed dismantled and meticulously packed on carts. Why undergo all of that intense trouble? Precisely because the bed wasn't just furniture. It was effectively life support. To attempt to sleep in an unfamiliar castle or abbey without the benefit of your own personal canopy and curtains was to genuinely risk shivering for the entire night. A curious detail consistently crops up in some English sources. The curtains themselves were occasionally waxed or carefully lined with oiled cloth to more effectively block drafts. Imagine the tangible experience of pulling those curtains closed. The heavy fabric, faintly smelling of beeswax or resin. They didn't just physically block the cold. They also successfully created darkness, effectively muffling sound and light, deliberately giving the powerful illusion of privacy in rooms that were rarely truly private. Modern scholars still actively discuss how effective these specialized beds truly were. Did they genuinely warm sleepers, or do later romantic depictions exaggerate their actual usefulness? Archaeological evidence strongly suggests the curtains were thick and layered, so there exists a solid reason to believe they were fundamentally functional. Yet, some forcefully argue the warmth was psychological as much as it was physical, the comforting feeling of being enclosed, sheltered, effectively hidden away from the cavernous cold. The crucial debate continues, but what remains fundamentally certain is that historical people believed in their importance so strongly that entirely portable beds became a noble necessity. Now, vividly picture yourself sliding into one. The bed creaks under your weight, the straw mattress gently rustles, and then you deliberately reach to pull the curtain closed. Instantly, the surrounding air feels different. Still cold, yes, but no longer actively assaulted by drafts rushing in from the arrow slits. Your breath fogs less quickly. Your body gently relaxes into the layered covers, and you profoundly sense that you might actually fall asleep. The heavy curtain muffles the faint drip of water from the damp walls, the distant cough of a servant in the hallway, even the remote bark of a dog outside. Inside, the enclosed space smells of fabric and fur, faintly musky, but fundamentally comforting. You only clearly hear the rustle of your blankets when you intentionally shift your position. The chamber beyond may be vast and incredibly inhospitable. But right here, inside your bed, you've successfully carved out a pocket of life, aggressively against the elements. It certainly wasn't completely foolproof. Some nights the heavy curtains froze stiff where condensation had consistently collected. Other nights, the lingering smoke from the hearth drifted inside, successfully choking you awake. But for the majority of nobles, the four-poster canopy bed represented the absolute best defense available against the nightly siege of cold. And this is precisely where you realize the genuine ingenuity of medieval people was not found in grand inventions, but in small, deeply clever adaptations. No central heating? Then build a private climate bubble. No insulation? Then hang thick curtains and intentionally seal yourself in. Every passing night represented a fundamental negotiation with the cold, and the canopy bed was the nearest thing to a truce. Imagine, intensely lying there now. Your eyelids grow heavy, the world positioned beyond the curtain slowly fading into silence. The chamber is still cold, the castle still persistently drafty, but you've successfully made a space where survival feels profoundly possible. You gently drift towards sleep, not because the night has magically grown warmer, but specifically because you've successfully managed, through the simple means of fabric and wood, to outwit it just enough. Beneath all those numerous blankets and curtains, the foundation of your night's crucial rest was still the mattress itself. What physically lay under you could actively determine whether you successfully passed the night in some tolerable level of comfort, or whether you ultimately woke aching, frozen, and irritable. In the Middle Ages, available bedding came in many diverse forms, but two distinct types consistently stood out: the feather bed and the humble straw tick. The feather bed was consistently the luxury choice. Imagine the sensation of sinking into a large sack purposefully stuffed with goose or duck feathers, feeling incredibly soft and pliable, actively cradling your body with warmth. Detailed inventories from various noble estates often meticulously list multiple feather beds, carefully stored and moved along with the household whenever the lord happened to travel. A truly well-stuffed feather mattress could be so incredibly thick that one sat nearly a foot above the bed frame, a truly bouncy cushion inside an otherwise profoundly unforgiving chamber. Families highly prized them, actively guarded them, and proudly passed them down as treasured possessions. They weren't simply deeply comfortable. They also functioned as potent symbols of status. But here existed a notable twist. Feather beds could also unfortunately become suffocatingly hot, actively trapping body heat until sleepers woke drenched in sweat, even during the dead of winter. One genuinely amusing complaint survives from a 15th century letter, where a visiting guest openly moaned that his host's bed swallowed him completely like a goose in a pot. Too many feathers simply meant you sank too deep, and instead of a gently cushioned sleep, you spent the intense night struggling to crawl back to the surface. For the majority of historical people, though, the harsh reality was a straw tick, a large sack purposefully filled with straw, hay, or reeds, densely stuffed until it successfully formed a crude mattress. Peasants consistently used them, soldiers consistently used them, and even large castles successfully filled their lesser chambers with them. They were relatively cheap, easy to refill, and moderately effective at lifting you slightly off the icy floor. But straw consistently came with its own curses. It quickly flattened, persistently poked through the cloth, and often actively harbored fleas. Households were forced to beat the bed regularly, literally whacking and vigorously shaking the straw sack to successfully fluff it up and forcibly drive out vermin. By the coming of morning, your body might intensely itch from straw scratches, but at the very least, you had successfully survived the night. Contemporary sources consistently note a strange detail. Some people deliberately mixed herbs into the straw, not solely to sweeten the smell, but also to intentionally ward off pests. Lavender, mint, or pennyroyal might be casually tossed in, successfully leaving a faint fragrance that successfully masked the sour odor of damp hay. If you have ever intentionally slept on a straw-stuffed mattress, you intrinsically know the smell never quite leaves. It relentlessly lingers, earthy and musty, persistently seeping into clothes and hair. Researchers still actively debate just how common featherbeds really were. Some argue they were incredibly rare luxuries, specifically reserved for the very top tier of society. Others consistently point to records showing middling households owning at least one feather bed, strongly suggesting they were more widespread than previously assumed. The ongoing disagreement comes down to patchy evidence, but what it undeniably reveals is that essential sleeping surfaces mattered deeply enough to be meticulously recorded. Imagine yourself finally lying down on a straw tick inside a drafty chamber. The sack rustles noticeably beneath you, uneven lumps pressing uncomfortably against your back. Each small shift releases a puff of grassy scent successfully mixed with the faint sharpness of herbs. You clearly hear the tiny scurry of mice somewhere within the rushes on the floor, and you nervously wonder if they'll pay you a visit. The heavy blankets above press down heavily, but the straw below reminds you that personal comfort in this age was never guaranteed. Now vividly picture the alternative, a featherbed situated inside a noble room. You sink deep into the softness, your body fully embraced by down. It feels genuinely heavenly, until the intense warmth grows stifling. The feathers shift, and you suddenly roll into a hollow that noticeably cradles you a little too tightly. You purposefully push at the blankets, desperately searching for fresh air, but the surrounding curtains trap everything in. You ultimately fall back asleep anyway, intrinsically knowing this discomfort is still 1,000 times better than straw. The stark choice between straw and feathers clearly mirrored the medieval social ladder. To lie on feathers was to definitively belong to the privileged. To lie on straw was to reluctantly accept necessity. Both options, however, represented direct responses to the same underlying challenge, successfully keeping the body alive inside cold, unforgiving stone chambers. And so, as you gently drift off inside your vividly imagined bed tonight, you suddenly realize that medieval sleepers were never passive. Every mattress, whether inherently humble or truly grand, represented effort, adaptation, and a small, crucial victory over the cold. You didn't just carelessly collapse into bed. You consciously made a strategic decision. Sink into feathers, or simply endure straw, all in the urgent hope of successfully surviving until dawn. Even the most meticulously carefully built bed, featuring its heavy curtains, feather mattresses, and numerous heaps of blankets, couldn't always successfully guarantee survival on its own. What truly made the difference on the absolute coldest nights wasn't furniture. It was, crucially, company. Sleeping alone inside a stone chamber simply meant your valuable body heat would continually bleed into the walls. Sleeping beside others crucially meant warmth multiplied. Bodies, actively acting like radiators intentionally pressed together in the dark. Noble families intrinsically understood this, though they rarely openly admitted it. Servants often intentionally slept in adjoining rooms, or even physically on pallets positioned right at the foot of the master's bed. The specific arrangement wasn't solely about service or security. It was also profoundly practical. More people successfully packed into a space meant higher temperatures, even if only by a few precious degrees. You might not immediately notice the warmth at first, but come the depth of midnight, when heavy frost gathered visibly on the inside of the shutters, every extra body genuinely counted. Accounts meticulously preserved from medieval monasteries clearly reveal that monks slept in long rows, their cots or straw beds intentionally side by side inside drafty dormitories. The underlying reasoning wasn't solely communal discipline. It was also fundamental survival. In those intensely crowded quarters, collective body heat successfully created a layer of insulation, however thin. The exact same principle applied in barracks, where numerous soldiers huddled in rows, thick cloaks pulled tight, instinctively trusting that together they'd resist the chill far better than alone. A fascinating, curious anecdote comes from a 14th century English manor. One specific nobleman's will specifically ordered that his favourite squire be formally granted a place near his lord's chamber fire at night. Scholars readily interpret this not solely as a mark of favour, but as a stark admission that the warmth of companionship was as valuable as inheritance. To be formally invited to share a bed or chamber was not merely simple intimacy. It was a clear privilege of warmth. There was, naturally, another crucial layer to the practice. Animals. Dogs in particular eventually became literal heaters. The well-known phrase "a three-dog night" may have originated much later in folklore, but the underlying idea is rooted in reality. Medieval people frequently allowed hounds into the bed, not solely for basic companionship, but precisely because the animals actively radiated heat. A couple of large mastiffs curled comfortably at your feet might easily mean the crucial difference between numb toes and comfort. Travelers even officially recorded that, in some inns, guests were forced to sleep packed together with dogs, goats, or even sheep positioned right beside them. The lingering smell was intense, but the crucial warmth trumped fragrance. Scholarly debate actively continues over just how socially acceptable bed sharing was among nobles. Some argue it was completely routine. Powerful lords with trusted companions, noble ladies with maids, weary travelers with strangers. Others forcefully insist that among the elite such intimacy was typically limited and carefully controlled, with servants actively relegated to nearby pallets, rather than inside the bed itself. What is clear, however, is that in the lower social classes, bed sharing was completely normal. Families literally piled together, parents, children, and often grandparents, successfully forming a tangle of limbs beneath a single heap of blankets. Personal privacy meant little when fundamental survival was at stake. Imagine now that you physically lie in such a bed, not alone, but intentionally pressed shoulder to shoulder with others. The first few minutes feel intensely awkward. Elbows poke. Someone coughs. A blanket slips. But very soon the crucial warmth builds. A successfully shared cocoon of body heat. You actively feel the dog's weight heavily against your feet, clearly hear the soft breathing of your companions, and slowly your tense muscles unclench. The castle may fiercely howl with wind, but safely inside this cluster you almost profoundly believe in comfort. Of course, this arrangement came with drawbacks. Fleas and lice spread easily, and whispered secrets in the dark were readily carried. But when you honestly weighed those irritations against the undeniable risk of shivering through a completely sleepless night, the crucial choice was simple. You always chose warmth over dignity, companionship over solitude. To modern minds, the very thought of sharing a bed with servants, siblings, or animals may feel intensely uncomfortable. But for the medieval sleeper, it was an essential survival strategy, widely passed down and accepted as fundamental common sense. In a harsh world composed of stone and frost, every extra body was a profound blessing. So as you gently pull your own blanket tighter tonight, intentionally think of those long-ago sleepers who actively faced the same cold but possessed fewer defenses. Their ultimate solution was simple. Share whatever warmth you had, and simply hope the night would be merciful. Imagine finally blowing out your candle and purposefully settling under the covers. It isn't solely the numerous blankets or the crucial bed curtains that successfully keep you alive tonight. It's also precisely what you're wearing. Unlike the prevalent modern custom of simply slipping into pajamas, or even nothing at all, medieval people frequently went to sleep nearly as bundled up as they were by day. Clothing itself became part of the insulation system. Household accounts and various surviving garments clearly show that the staple bedtime attire was the nightshirt, a long, deliberately loose linen garment profoundly resembling an oversized tunic. Linen might not initially sound warm to you, but it was the profoundly practical choice. It was relatively easy to launder compared to wool, relatively smooth against the skin and fundamentally breathable. Over that, you might intentionally throw on an extra wool tunic or even a heavy cloak, entirely depending on the severity of the cold. To medieval minds, the more layers the better. But one crucial detail stands out: the nightcap, or coif. These were small cloth caps, typically tied under the chin, or simply purposefully pulled snugly over the head. Why such a significant emphasis on covering the skull? Precisely because it was widely believed, quite sensibly, that the majority of crucial body heat escaped through the head. A medieval sleeper completely without a coif was profoundly like a knight without armor, dangerously exposed. Illuminated manuscripts even consistently show figures tucked into bed with their heads neatly wrapped, appearing more like they're entirely ready for travel than for simple dreams. The nightshirt itself could drastically vary in length. Impoverished families simply wore what they had, often their undertunic repurposed for sleeping. Wealthier nobles sometimes commissioned nightwear, intricately embroidered with fine thread or noticeably edged in fur. Some noble ladies even possessed sleeping hoods that prominently trailed with ribbons, though one strongly suspects those were intensely impractical in reality. Whatever the specific style, the underlying principle was clear: cover everything you could. A fascinating, curious note from a 15th century medical text explicitly recommends that sleepers bind their feet in linen or wool aggressively against the night air. This was not mere fashion. It was early, crucial recognition that extremities froze first. People intentionally wrapped their toes, ankles, and even hands in numerous strips of cloth before bed, effectively creating makeshift socks and mittens. You can almost tangibly feel it. Your hands securely swaddled, your feet entirely cocooned, every single inch of skin shielded from the relentless cold. But what about the ongoing debate? Scholars remain firmly divided over how widely specialized sleep clothing existed as opposed to simply reusing daytime garments. Some forcefully argue that for peasants there was no such thing as nightwear. People simply collapsed in whatever they wore during the day. Others consistently point to wills and inventories that specifically mention night linens, strongly suggesting that, at least for the middle and upper social classes, distinct sleep attire was completely normal. Both perspectives ultimately hold truth entirely depending on rank and region. But all parties universally agree that covering up at night was non-negotiable. Now vividly picture yourself preparing for bed in this specific manner. You strip off your heavier outer layers, gently slip into a long linen shirt, and precisely tug a cap snugly over your ears. The air sharply nips at your neck until you quickly pull the blankets up. Every fiber of fabric successfully adds a tiny layer of defense, and together they successfully form a cocoon. The bed might be noticeably drafty, the room completely freezing, but at least your body has successfully become a fortress of cloth. The sensory details are vivid. The linen feels cool and faintly scratchy at first, gradually warming as your skin heats it. The wool visibly smells faintly of sheep and lanolin, earthy but reassuring. Your cap presses gently around your head, actively muting sound and successfully making you feel enclosed. You wriggle into position, meticulously swaddled like a parcel, and simply wait for sleep to come. There was another important reason for night clothes beyond simple warmth: modesty. In a social world where bed sharing was completely common, being half-dressed or completely naked was socially unacceptable. Even married couples were frequently depicted in manuscripts intentionally wearing caps and long shirts in bed. It wasn't solely about successfully surviving the night. It was fundamentally about propriety. And so whether you were a noble lord, a noble lady, a simple servant, or a dedicated soldier, your night shirt and coif served a crucial social function as much as a practical one. Think of the distinct rhythm of such nights. The precise ritual of dressing not down but actively up, intentionally layering more cloth, tying knots, and meticulously smoothing wrinkles before finally extinguishing the light. In our modern sense, nightwear is associated with relaxation. For the medieval sleeper, it was armor against the elements. So as you gently tug your own blanket tonight, intentionally think of those long-ago figures who consciously climbed into bed, looking much more like travelers than simple dreamers, purposefully bundled in linen and wool, their heads securely wrapped tightly against the dark. Their sleep was certainly not effortless. It was meticulously engineered stitch by stitch, layer by layer, aggressively against the endless siege of cold stone. Picture the precise moment before you slip under the covers. A servant deliberately steps forward, carefully carrying a long-handled pan, its brass surface visibly glowing faintly in the diminishing firelight. Inside, hot coals crackle and hiss, successfully filling the chamber with the potent smell of ash and heated metal. This genuinely curious object was the indispensable medieval warming pan, a tool as incredibly simple as it was ingenious, because who truly wanted to crawl into sheets that physically felt like blocks of ice? The entire ritual went like this. The servant quickly slid the pan back and forth between the bedding layers, the hot coals inside radiating heat successfully through tiny perforations. The sheets positioned above noticeably puffed with smoke, and the air was subtly filled with the faint tang of burning wood. For a brief few minutes, the bed perceptibly transformed from a frozen slab into something genuinely almost inviting. Without this crucial step, you might easily lie shivering for an hour, before your own body heat finally successfully softened the chill. Surviving inventories from noble households often list warming pans right alongside candlesticks and chamber pots, identifying them as ordinary tools of nightly life. They weren't particularly rare. They were actively expected. By the later Middle Ages, wealthy homes throughout Europe consistently treated them as essential during winter. A chamber completely without one was either entirely neglected or occupied by someone low enough in social status not to warrant the crucial luxury. But these specific pans carried hazards too. Contemporary letters openly complain of sheets scorched black or even actively set ablaze when servants carelessly left the pan in one place too long. Imagine the shock of sliding into bed, only to discover a smoking hole where your linen should have been. There exist various stories, some half comical, others half tragic, of noble men quickly springing from bed in the middle of the night because sparks emanating from a warming pan had successfully caught the blankets in a wooden-roofed chamber filled with dry rushes. Such accidents were never a small matter. One particularly odd account from Italy vividly describes sprinkling aromatic herbs directly onto the hot coals before successfully warming the bed. The lingering smoke left behind was genuinely thought to purify the air and actively ward off disease. You can almost tangibly smell it now. Lavender and rosemary mingling with the sharp tang of embers, persistently clinging to the fabric as you finally climb beneath it. The underlying belief successfully combined practicality with superstition. A nightly battle against both cold and invisible illnesses. Specialists in medieval domestic life still actively discuss how widespread warming pans truly were. Some scholars argue they were strictly confined mainly to high-status households, being far too expensive and risky for common folk. Others actively counter that simpler versions such as basic clay pots, purposefully filled with embers and carefully wrapped in cloth, were completely common among middling families. The truth remains elusive precisely because such humble items rarely successfully survived. What's absolutely clear, however, is that some method of preheating the bed existed across all of society, even if the specific form actively varied. Now, vividly imagine yourself watching the entire process inside your chamber. The servant steadily draws the pan consistently across the sheets, faint steam rising gently as persistent dampness evaporates. When the pan is reluctantly withdrawn, the air successfully trapped under the covers is unexpectedly warm, almost startling after the bitter cold of the surrounding room. You slide inside quickly, desperately trying to trap that heat before it successfully escapes. For a precious few minutes, the cocoon feels incredibly blissful, as if you've successfully stolen a pocket of summer right in the heart of winter. But it regrettably doesn't last. The warmth rapidly fades, purposefully replaced once more by the relentless chill of the castle walls. The crucial trick was never about keeping you comfortable all night. It was solely about making the first moments of sleep bearable. Once your tired body successfully relaxed, once sheer exhaustion overcame the shivering, you were far more likely to gently drift into slumber and consciously let your own heat do the rest. The warming pan was a powerful symbol of compromise. Never completely enough to solve the cold entirely, but enough to successfully buy you a start. In a distinct way, it was truly like striking a bargain with the night. Give me a few minutes of comfort, and I'll agree to endure the rest. As you intensely imagine yourself lying there, gently drifting off with the faint scent of embers still persistently clinging to your sheets, you suddenly realize just how ritualized medieval sleep really was. Every evening actively involved a choreography of tools, garments, and gestures. The warming pan wasn't a luxury for show. It was an essential part of the survival kit, and completely without it, many nights would have simply begun in misery rather than comfortable rest. You gently stir in your imagined bed, purposely tugging the heavy blankets closer, when suddenly you physically feel a weight press against your legs. A truly warm, solid shape curls itself into the crook of your knees, sighs contentedly, and successfully settles down for the night. It isn't another human person. It's a dog, or perhaps even two, maybe even three, if you were truly lucky. The common practice of letting animals share the bed was far from entirely unusual. Dogs especially were not solely guardians of property or simple hunting companions. They were, critically, heaters. Their numerous thick coats radiated warmth, and their fierce loyalty meant they would intentionally stay near their masters through the long hours of the dark. A castle chamber that previously felt like an ice cave could become significantly more bearable with a few loyal hounds snuggled up at your feet. Wills and household records meticulously preserved from the later Middle Ages occasionally mentioned small lapdogs formerly gifted to noble women, not solely for basic companionship, but primarily for crucial warmth in bed. These comfort dogs, as we might refer to them now, were intensely pampered creatures, meticulously brushed and perfumed. But their single most important role was to desperately chase away the chill of winter nights. Larger dog breeds, meanwhile, were often stretched out like furry logs intentionally across the bottom of the bed, successfully protecting toes from frostbite. There is even a truly curious reference from Scandinavia vividly describing how travelers in winter inns frequently requested to sleep in stalls with animals rather than inside the unheated guest rooms. Horses, cattle, and sheep actively produce so much heat that sleeping very near them was profoundly preferable to a lonely bed inside stone. Imagine peacefully drifting off to the steady, soft breathing of a cow positioned right beside you. The air would be heavy with the rich smell of hay, but your body would be genuinely warmed by the sheer heat of its bulk. Not glamorous, but profoundly effective. Dogs, however, consistently carried a special intimacy. A medieval proverb widely used in French asserts that a faithful dog keeps the frost away from his master's heart. Its depths both completely literal and deeply poetic. The animal's warmth successfully sustained the body, while its presence successfully soothed the spirit inside lonely, drafty castles. Scholarly debate actively continues over just how universal this practice was. Some actively maintain that allowing animals in noble beds was consistently frowned upon in formal households, actively relegated to private indulgence rather than an open custom. Others forcefully argue the evidence suggests it was widespread, particularly in rural or frontier castles, where simple survival mattered more than etiquette. The debate consistently circles around whether the vivid image of a lady sleeping with a lapdog is simply romantic exaggeration or practical truth. Now, vividly picture the scene. You lie swaddled inside your linen nightshirt and numerous wool blankets, the curtains of the bed securely drawn tight. Outside, the persistent wind shrieks aggressively along the battlements. Your toes ache with cold, until suddenly you physically feel the warmth of a hound actively pressed against them. Its fur is coarse, its body solid, and though it noticeably carries the scent of the hunt and the outdoors, you welcome it without hesitation. Another dog curls comfortably at your side, and very soon you are entirely cocooned, not solely in cloth, but in living heat. The chamber may still be undeniably icy, but safely inside the bed, the world is fundamentally transformed. Of course, this arrangement came with inconveniences. Dogs frequently shed hair, sometimes dragged in dirt, and occasionally gnawed on bones cleverly hidden under the covers. Various insects traveled with them, actively spreading to their human companions. And yet, the crucial trade-off was worth it. Better fleas than frostbite. Better a dirty blanket than a night without sleep. The sensory mix is unforgettable. The earthy smell of dog fur, the faint smoke clinging to your clothes, the heavy press of blankets, and underneath it all, the steady rhythm of another creature's breathing. It's no surprise people spoke of their animals with genuine affection bordering on reverence. To actively share warmth was to actively share survival. The potent image of the three-dog night, though a phrase coined much later, successfully captures the essence of medieval sleeping habits. 1 dog simply meant manageable cold. 2 clearly meant serious chill. 3 dogs meant the night was so intensely bitter that even nobles intentionally stacked every possible source of heat into the bed. So, as you lie there inside your own comfortable bed tonight, intentionally think of how extraordinary it must have felt for those historical people in castles, isolated by stone, aggressively assaulted by drafts, completely surrounded by darkness, to draw strength and comfort from the simple loyalty of an animal, actively curled by their side. In that small, crucial exchange of warmth, human and dog successfully kept each other alive through countless winter nights. Pull the heavy curtains back for a brief moment, and intentionally step outside the noble chamber in your vivid imagination. Across the immense courtyard, situated in the shadowed servants' quarters, another world of sleep unfolds. The stark contrast between peasant and noble slumber was profound, and yet the ultimate outcome, fundamental survival, through bitterly cold nights, was the same essential goal. Who then truly slept warmer? The definitive answer might actually surprise you. Nobles certainly possessed grandeur, featherbeds, fur coverlets, warming pans, and thick canopies. But grandeur did not always mean comfort. Their specific bedchambers were vast and cavernous, purposefully built for display as much as for rest, and all that immense space made them genuinely impossible to heat. Even with fiercely roaring fireplaces, the heavy stone swallowed warmth completely like a sponge. So a lord might physically lie on heaps of down and fur, yet still visibly breathe air that froze into mist right before his eyes. Meanwhile, peasants primarily lived in humbler houses, constructed of timber and daub, small enough that a single hearth successfully warmed the entire interior. A thatched roof thick with straw actively acted as insulation. Families were purposefully huddled together, often with domestic animals stabled at one end of the room, and the immense combined heat successfully kept the air far more tolerable than inside a drafty keep. A visitor to a 14th century English village wrote with mild astonishment that even though the huts were visibly mean, they successfully held warmth far better than the Lord's Tower. And yet, social status determined more than comfort. Nobles possessed exclusive access to finer materials, wool of exceptionally high quality, imported furs, linen that successfully softened with washing. Peasants were forced to make do with coarse wool and blankets intensely patched until they became thin or simple sheepskins roughly cured in smokehouses. Their bedding noticeably smelled strongly of lanolin and hearth smoke, and though it successfully insulated well, it never visually looked or tangibly felt luxurious. One fascinating curious note from memorial records clearly shows that peasants sometimes slept directly on benches intentionally positioned near the fire, their children actively curled in their laps. They consistently risked sparks and smoke, but the intense closeness to the hearth guaranteed warmth. In profound contrast, the noble's bedchamber, intentionally separated from the great hall, often sadly lacked that immediate heat. Comfort was thus noticeably unevenly distributed, not always successfully in the way you would naturally expect. Researchers today still actively puzzle over the real hierarchy of warmth. Did wealth automatically buy you better sleep, or did peasants, inside their cramped but snug cottages, successfully manage to endure the winter nights more easily? Evidence consistently points both ways. Some scholars strongly argue that nobles' sheer volume of textiles kept them superior. Others forcefully insist the smaller communal spaces of the lower classes offered profound practical warmth that the aristocracy's grandeur simply could not match. The discussion regrettably remains unresolved, successfully highlighting how much sleep itself mirrored social divisions. Imagine now the two scenes side by side. Inside the castle, a nobleman nervously shifts beneath heavy layers, his breath curling white, the vast room intensely echoing with every gust of wind aggressively hitting the shutters. Down in the humble village, a peasant family squeezes onto a straw mattress right before the hearth. Children are comfortably nestled like kittens, the subtle smell of animals drifting from the stall positioned nearby. One bed is highly ornate and stiffly formal, the other intensely crowded and earthy. But which single body wakes warmer? The crucial question lingers, and perhaps no one definitive answer successfully fits all cases. Still, both noble and peasant consistently shared one truth. They successfully adapted. Survival in the medieval night was fundamentally not about absolute comfort, but about deliberately learning to live with hardship, consciously reshaping homes and habits until the act of rest became possible. Nobles may have ostentatiously flaunted luxury. Peasants may have purely relied on closeness and simplicity, but all successfully slept under the same winter stars, simultaneously shivering and dreaming their way inevitably toward morning. As you gently drift in your own warm bed tonight, you can acutely sense the irony. Social status determined the trappings, but not always the quality of medieval sleep. Sometimes the humblest hut held more genuine warmth than the grandest hall. You might naturally think that once a bed was established inside a noble chamber, it absolutely never moved. After all, these beds were massive objects heavy with intricately carved posts and curtains. But in consistent practice, families frequently shifted where they slept entirely according to the season. Bedrooms were never fixed, timeless sanctuaries. They were exceptionally flexible spaces intentionally chosen for their relationship to sunlight, fire, and wind. In other words, you relentlessly chased the sun in winter and consciously fled it in summer. Documents meticulously preserved from noble estates plainly reveal this habit. Some castles actively had winter chambers and summer chambers, not because people simply wanted a change of scenery, but precisely because the physics of warmth demanded it. In the most intensely cold months, families consciously moved into rooms with strong southern exposure, where the weak sun successfully struck through the windows for a few precious hours each day. The walls positioned there successfully stored a little more heat. The air perceptibly felt a little less hostile, and the simple act of waking up wasn't quite so brutal. Come summer, they intentionally abandoned those sunlit spaces and consciously retreated into north-facing rooms, which were noticeably darker and cooler. There is a well-documented example found in the accounts of Edward IV's household, where entire beds and furnishings were moved seasonally. Servants diligently carried feather beds, linens and tapestries from one chamber to another, successfully creating temporary nests wherever the king specifically chose to rest. It was a significant logistical ordeal, but for those historical individuals living in stone palaces, this crucial mobility was essential to survive. A fascinating, curious note survives from a Burgundian courtier who openly complained in a letter that he entirely lost his chamber to the frost one year. The walls, he vividly said, grew so damp and cold that he outright refused to sleep there, consciously choosing instead a narrower room, actively facing the rising sun. His specific phrasing urgently reminds us that in castles the building itself was an adversary. Rooms were successfully conquered by cold, surrendered, and actively retaken with the passing seasons. Archaeologists and architectural historians still actively debate whether every castle truly offered multiple seasonal chambers, or whether this was solely a luxury of the grandest estates. Some argue that the majority of castles only possessed a few suitable rooms for sleeping, consequently forcing residents to endure the cold where they were. Others forcefully insist that evidence of window placements, fireplaces, and surviving records consistently shows intentional design for seasonal living. The argument regrettably remains unresolved, but the overall image is profoundly persuasive. A noble family actively migrating within its own walls, much like birds shifting nests as the weather dramatically turned. Now vividly imagine yourself following this specific routine. In the season of autumn, you begin to carefully eye the sunlit side of the keep, intrinsically knowing that soon the long nights will demand every advantage. Servants diligently dismantle your bed, patiently hauling frame, mattress and hangings piece by piece. The sound of diligent carpenters, adjusting posts intensely echoes in the new chamber, while intricate tapestries are aggressively hammered into place to successfully block drafts. By the precise time the first frost comes, you are comfortably tucked into a room that at least successfully greets you with pale shafts of morning light. The sensory detail is vivid. You wake to the thin warmth of the sun, actively filtering through shutters, the distinct smell of woolen curtains freshly rehung, and the faint sound of servants sweeping rushes across the floor of your relocated chamber. The conscious shift does not eliminate the cold. It simply successfully manages it, intentionally turning unbearable into survivable. Peasants too successfully shifted their sleeping spaces seasonally, though far less formally. Families might sleep incredibly close to the hearth in winter, tightly crowding around the fire in one small room, and then consciously retreat to lofts or barns in summer, where the air was noticeably cooler. In both castles and cottages, sleep was incredibly mobile, deliberately dictated by the elements rather than a rigid interior design. This pervasive practice reminds you that medieval life possessed very little of our modern concept of fixed bedrooms. A bedroom wasn't a permanent sacred space. It was a purely temporary camp within the larger fortress of stone. Beds were consistently moved, chambers rotated, and life successfully adapted in perfect rhythm with the seasons. The castle itself was profoundly alive, continuously reshaped by light and temperature, its inhabitants consistently shifting like nomads within its massive walls. And so you clearly see another truth of medieval sleep. It was profoundly dynamic, not static. The relentless fight against cold demanded movement, planning, and constant adjustment. You did not simply sleep where you wanted. You intentionally slept where the sun, the wind, and the damp permitted. And each passing year, as the earth slowly turned, you intentionally began that cycle again. Stand for a brief moment by the narrow window of a medieval chamber, and actively feel the draft slip chillingly across your skin. Unlike today's homes with their sealed frames and glass panes, castle windows were incredibly vulnerable holes in the wall. They successfully served as defenses against arrows, but acted as relentless invitations to the wind. Devoid of glass, entirely without double glazing, without even the basic notion of insulation, these openings were simply covered by shutters or stretched cloth that successfully kept out little more than rain and birds. Written surveys meticulously preserved from medieval households clearly reveal that in many castles, glass was so incredibly rare, it was intentionally reserved for chapels or the lord's private oratory. Ordinary chambers possessed wooden shutters, thick planks that could be actively barred from the inside. In summer they intentionally stood open for light and air, but in winter they shut tight, persistently creaking in the wind. Yet simple wood alone was no shield against the chill. Cold continuously crept through cracks, and the entire room eventually grew damp. A profoundly practical solution was to actively stretch cloth across the opening, sometimes linen intentionally soaked in oil or wax to successfully make it translucent and effectively resistant to rain. By day, this simple material allowed a dim amber glow to enter, soft and hazy much like sunlight through parchment. By night, it successfully dulled the shriek of the wind, but never completely silenced it. The fabric persistently flapped, the frame continually rattled, and weary sleepers quickly learned to live with the constant reminder that their fortress was deeply porous. One truly intriguing reference comes from a 13th-century French household account vividly describing horn windows. Thin slices of animal horn were aggressively scraped, translucent, and successfully set into wooden frames. These provided a crude but genuinely sturdier alternative to cloth. They successfully admitted pale light and actively resisted weather better, though they quickly yellowed and warped. Imagine intently looking out through such panes. The external world perceptibly blurred as if actively seen through fogged glass. Yet safely inside your chamber, the air was just a fraction less brutal. Archaeologists and architectural historians still actively debate how common these horn or oiled cloth windows really were. Some argue they were strictly luxuries of the wealthiest castles, while the majority of households solely relied only on shutters. Others aggressively suggest that by the later Middle Ages, they were surprisingly widespread throughout Northern Europe. The available evidence is fragmentary, but the very existence of the debate reminds us how utterly desperate historical people were to successfully improvise barriers between themselves and the cold. Now vividly picture yourself at such a window. The shutter is securely drawn, the cloth carefully tacked across the frame, and still a sharp line of frost forms tenaciously along the sill. Your breath clouds noticeably as you lean near it. Outside, the new snow successfully reflects the moonlight. But inside, you clearly hear the faint rattle of wood and the low moan of wind desperately searching for a gap. No matter how carefully you successfully hang your bed curtains, you intrinsically know the draft will find its way to you. The soundscape is profoundly haunting. Shutters aggressively banging in a distant corridor. Fabric suddenly snapping faintly like sails. Servants quietly muttering as they successfully stuff rags into cracks. Some households even intentionally pressed moss or clay into persistent gaps around the frames as makeshift insulation. It was messy, unsightly, and purely temporary. But when the night dipped aggressively below freezing, any single measure was better than none. Peasants inside cottages actively faced the same battle. Their houses frequently had no windows at all, just simple shutters to close off narrow slits. Some successfully used bladder membranes from animals carefully stretched thin to let in a little light. The resulting effect was eerie. Rooms gently glowed faintly, but with profoundly distorted shadows, as if the external world was situated behind a veil. At night, though, even these simple coverings hardened with frost, actively turning translucent sheets into brittle ice. For nobles, the overall irony was bitter. Their high towers successfully gave them status and defense, but also consistently exposed them to cutting winds. Visiting guests sometimes openly remarked that the higher they slept, the colder they felt. A humble peasant inside his low hut might readily envy the wealth of a lord, but not the persistent draft whistling through a tower chamber window. And yet, there existed a subtle beauty too. Imagine intensely lying in bed on a moonlit night. The shutters cracked just enough to intentionally let silver light wash across the floor. The cold perpetually seeped in. Yes, but also a poetry of shadows. The clear silhouette of branches actively against the curtain, the faint glow of snow outside. Medieval sleep was a complex balance of discomfort and wonder, where the absolute harshest nights also successfully offered moments of fragile peace. So when you successfully draw your own curtains tonight, vividly picture those ancient windows. They served less as barriers than constant reminders that no matter how thick the walls, the night consistently always found its way in. Sleep was never fundamentally about actively conquering the cold entirely. It was solely about deliberately learning to live with it, persistent draft after persistent draft, until morning finally broke. You vividly picture yourself approaching the hearth of a castle bedchamber, actively expecting salvation in the blaze. Surely a large fire inside a stone room must genuinely mean warmth. But the underlying reality is far less comforting. Medieval fireplaces were truly enormous, their vast chimneys yawning wide enough that entire trees could be successfully fed into them. Yet, for all their imposing spectacle, they were profoundly poor at actually heating the space. The underlying reason was simple physics. The wider the chimney, the more precious heat escaped directly upward, along with the smoke. Flames roared, sparks danced, logs eventually collapsed into glowing embers, and yet step more than a few paces away, and your breath still consistently misted in the air. The fire successfully created a bright oasis of heat in its immediate circle. But beyond that specific point, the castle chamber consistently remained bitterly cold. Household records consistently emphasize how much wood this demanded. A single winter week inside a large castle might successfully consume entire wagon loads of timber. Forest management became a constant concern, not solely for construction, but for necessary fuel. One noble lord in France openly complained bitterly in his letters that successfully keeping his great hall warm had effectively emptied the woods faster than any war. Fires actively devoured resources, yet rarely successfully provided the comfort one imagined. There are occasionally amusing accounts too. Visiting guests sometimes openly joked that noble fireplaces were genuinely big enough to roast an ox, but sadly, too weak to warm a man. The exaggeration accurately rings true. These vast hearths provided spectacle, light, and a true sense of majesty, but little genuine real relief against the unrelenting chill of stone walls. Some households actively experimented with placing iron firebacks right behind the flames, successfully reflecting heat into the room. Others meticulously lined hearths with tiles to successfully store warmth a little longer. But these various measures were only partial solutions. They were mere tinkering aggressively, against a problem too large to conquer fully. A fiercely blazing fire might successfully keep your feet warm if you sat right in front of it, but your back remained icy, and your bed positioned across the room might as well have been entirely outdoors. Scholars still actively dispute how effective castle fireplaces truly were. Some argue they provided meaningful warmth when successfully combined with hangings and heavy furniture, successfully creating a layered system of heat retention. Others contend they were almost solely symbolic, more about social status and ritual than actual comfort, since the majority of the energy simply vanished up the chimney. The truth likely varied from castle to castle, entirely depending on resources, design, and climate. Now vividly imagine yourself in such a room. The fire loudly crackles, actively spitting sparks onto the hearthstones. Smoke persistently curls upward, successfully leaving a faint tang in the air. Your face feels noticeably flushed, gently prickling with warmth, but your shoulders consistently remain cold. You cautiously shuffle closer, intently holding out your hands until you nearly singe your sleeves. Then reluctantly you retreat to your bed positioned across the chamber, only to quickly find the temperature drops with every single step. By the time you successfully slip under the blankets, you may as well have been entirely sitting outside. Peasants, by noticeable contrast, often benefited more from their smaller hearths. A single central fire inside a modest cottage successfully heated the whole interior, smoky though it was. The intensely cramped space meant that flames and bodies together successfully maintained tolerable warmth. The grand noble fireplaces, by stark contrast, simply burned through resources, but unfortunately left chambers half frozen. Grandeur once again noticeably failed to translate into comfort. And yet the precise ritual of the fire mattered. It wasn't exclusively about heat. It was fundamentally about gathering, about light, about the profound reassurance that at least something pushed back aggressively against the darkness. People consciously prayed by the fire, successfully shared stories by it, gently dozed in chairs beside it. Even when the warmth didn't successfully carry across the room, the intense glow offered psychological safety, a true beacon of life inside the cavernous cold. So when you actively imagine a medieval night, do not solely think of a roaring fireplace saving you from frost. Think instead of a fragile island of heat, situated inside a vast sea of icy air, a comfort that successfully lasted only as long as you stayed near, and a comfort that quickly disappeared the moment you climbed into bed. The hearth was profoundly a performance as much as a practical tool, and the medieval sleeper quickly learned to be grateful for what little it could give. You lean closer to that constantly glowing fireplace, and for a truly fleeting moment it feels safe. But then another persistent reality of medieval life asserts itself. Smoke. Fireplaces were never clean, efficient machines. They aggressively belched fumes, left soot, and successfully filled chambers with a haze that actively stung the eyes and settled on every single surface. To successfully stay warm by fire was to actively breathe smoke nightly, to passively accept blackened walls, and to inevitably wake with lungs coated in ash. Chroniclers of the time openly complained bitterly about it. One monk in northern England openly noted that his cell grew so coated with soot from the hearth that he openly coughed more than he prayed. Even nobles were not entirely immune. Court records consistently mention women lamenting ruined gowns and valuable linens discolored by constant smoke exposure. A newly cleaned tapestry might easily turn grey within a single winter. The architecture unfortunately made matters worse. Chimneys were wide, crude shafts completely without the draft control of modern flues. Smoke didn't always rise politely. It aggressively drifted, eddied, and stubbornly clung to the chamber. If the wind unexpectedly blew the wrong direction, it actively poured back into the room, successfully leaving everyone inside coughing. Imagine desperately trying to fall asleep while smoke noticeably burned your throat and your eyes were constantly watering. A fascinating, curious observation from various travelers' notes is that some people deliberately smeared their walls with lime or clay, not solely to brighten interiors, but actively to hide the streaks of soot. The persistent black residue never truly left, but at least the fragile illusion of cleanliness could be restored for a little while. The smell, however, was intensely permanent, a pungent mixture of charred wood, damp stone and burned wool that persistently clung to bedding and clothes. Scholars actively remain divided over just how tolerable these smoky rooms truly were. Some argue that medieval people simply adapted. Their bodies and expectations quickly hardened to it. Others forcefully insist that even contemporaries recognize the health toll, precisely pointing to repeated complaints in medical treatises about choked air and blackened lungs. Perhaps both theories are true. People successfully endured because they had no choice. But they never completely stopped grumbling about it. Now vividly imagine yourself lying in bed after such a smoky night. Your hair smells of smoke. Your blankets hold the acrid tang of ash. And when you cough, you actively taste bitterness on your tongue. The bed curtains successfully trap some of it inside. So even your tiny cocoon carries the ghost of the fire. Your chamber may have been noticeably warmer than before, but it significantly came at the cost of fresh air. Peasants sadly fared no better. Their cottages often lack chimneys altogether. Smoke emanating from the central hearth simply rose and filled the rafters, slowly leaking through the thatch. Children consistently grew up in houses perpetually hazed with smoke. Their lungs gradually blackened before adulthood. Yet, People widely saw it as normal. Some even genuinely believed the smoke helped preserve the timber roof, actively keeping insects away. Survival and persistent superstition actively blended together in every single breath. The sensory experience was profoundly overwhelming. Your skin noticeably prickled from soot particles. Your eyes constantly watered, and the rushes on the floor rapidly gathered black dust. Servants swept endlessly, though the entire effort felt purely futile. Every winter was precisely the same. A relentless battle against smoke, a relentless battle against cold, and the intrinsic knowledge that you couldn't successfully win one without intentionally worsening the other. And yet, despite the profound discomfort, fire was non-negotiable. No single person could successfully survive a castle winter without it. So people consciously made their peace. They proudly hung smoky tapestries. They successfully endured coughing fits. They actively scrubbed soot from their faces each morning. Crucial warmth demanded sacrifice. And the sacrifice was the comfort of clean air. So as you comfortably lie in your modern bed tonight, actively breathing comfortably without a single thought, consider how genuinely extraordinary such luxury is. For medieval sleepers, every warm night inevitably meant another smoky morning. Their dreams were actively steeped in the scent of burning wood. Their lives were consistently lived in the shadow of soot. When the fire noticeably dimmed and the night inevitably stretched on, the only remaining glow left inside a medieval chamber often solely came from a candle. You might easily imagine this delicate flame as mere decoration, a simple touch of ambience. But for many weary sleepers, the candle was also a source of fragile warmth. A single wick certainly couldn't successfully heat a whole room, of course. But in a harsh world where every single flicker counted, even the faintest contribution truly mattered, candles inside the Middle Ages came in many diverse forms. Wealthy households successfully burned beeswax, which naturally gave a clean, bright flame and successfully filled the air with a faint honeyed scent. These were incredibly expensive, strictly reserved for chapels, ceremonies, or noble chambers. More commonly, people utilized tallow candles purposefully made from rendered animal fat. These actively smoked, sputtered, and smelled profoundly of grease. Imagine gently drifting off to sleep while the acrid odor of burning tallow thickened the air, actively mingling with the damp of stone and the musk of wool. Yet candles were not solely light. They successfully generated a surprising amount of heat when positioned close by. Intentionally place one near your bed curtain, and you might clearly notice the fabric warming slightly to the touch. Some households actively arranged several candles together on stands, successfully creating clusters of flames that successfully offered both illumination and a valuable pocket of warmth. It was certainly hardly central heating, but it noticeably softened the edge of the cold in the immediate circle around them. A fascinating, curious anecdote survives from a 14th century letter vividly describing how a noble woman demanded 12 candles inside her chamber at once on winter nights, forcefully insisting that only then could she rest. The servants loudly grumbled at the extravagance, but her specific request successfully reveals a truth. People intentionally used light as a substitute heater, even when the resulting effect was purely marginal. The hazards were obvious. Candle flames easily toppled, and bed curtains rich with wool and linen were dangerously flammable. Records meticulously describe fires sparked by careless placement, rapidly reducing entire chambers to cinders. One particularly grim tale from Germany vividly tells of a squire who dozed off with a candle positioned on the bed rail. He quickly awoke to find his blankets aflame, and barely successfully escaped with his life. The servants actively blamed him for recklessness, but the real culprit was simple necessity. He had genuinely wanted a sliver of warmth positioned far too close at hand. Scholars still actively discuss whether medieval people understood the dangers fully, or whether the routine use of candles aggressively bred complacency. Some argue that inventories of charred textiles clearly show that accidents were common but widely accepted. Others believe the wealthy successfully minimized risk by intentionally assigning servants to monitor the lights deep into the night. Whatever the specific case, the crucial balance between danger and comfort was constant. Now vividly picture yourself in such a chamber. The fire in the hearth has slowly dwindled to embers, solely leaving only shadows crawling up the walls. A single candle actively burns on a wooden stand near your bed. Its glow is noticeably soft and golden, actively casting a halo that successfully reaches your hands as you successfully pull the covers tighter. The faint warmth radiates just enough that your face feels perceptibly less icy. The flame aggressively flickers, wax steadily drips down the side, and the distinct smell of smoke hangs faintly in the air. Outside your curtain, the rest of the room completely vanishes into darkness. You intently listen to the subtle sounds, the quiet pop of the wick, the low sigh of wind aggressively hitting the shutters, the soft drip of wax landing on metal. Your personal world successfully shrinks to this small circle of light and heat. The candle subsequently becomes not just illumination, but companionship, a fragile ally against the enormity of the night. In cottages and inns, simpler versions of this scene consistently played out. Travelers strategically placed rushlights, cheap reeds intentionally dipped in fat right beside their straw pallets. These actively burned quickly and unevenly, intensely hissing and spitting, but their faint glow successfully provided reassurance. Parents intentionally lit small lamps near children to aggressively chase away both cold and fear. Even monks who highly prized austerity allowed lamps to actively burn in dormitories, citing both safety and necessity. The sensory mixture was unforgettable. The air noticeably smelled of melted fat and smoke. The walls were intensely streaked with soot from months of burning. The bedding was visibly stained where wax had splattered. Yet people simply accepted these imperfections. In the harshest winter, the candle was fundamentally more than decoration. It was basic survival. So as you gently drift under your own clean electric light tonight, imagine the precarious flicker of a medieval flame. It warmed just enough to successfully trick the body into rest, and it relentlessly risked disaster with every spark. Sleep in the Middle Ages was never truly free from tension, even in the smallest details. To successfully close your eyes was to consciously trust that your fragile flame would successfully burn through the night without intentionally turning warmth into ruin. If you intentionally step away from noble chambers and into communal quarters, you successfully find another side of medieval sleep, the collective dormitory. Not every single person had the specific privilege of heavy curtains, feather beds, and private servants. Monks, soldiers, apprentices, and servants often successfully slept in shared spaces, where the crucial emphasis was far less on luxury and far more on endurance. Take the monastery as a simple example. Monastic rules explicitly prescribed that brothers live simply, which fundamentally meant their dormitories were vast halls intentionally lined with rows of beds or pallets. The stone floor relentlessly stretched, endlessly, noticeably broken only by narrow windows positioned high above. Each monk possessed his own small cot or straw mattress, sometimes little more than a simple wooden plank with a thin pad. The beds were strategically positioned side by side, so incredibly close that one monk could clearly hear the breathing of the next. Personal privacy was unknown, but the crucial warmth came from numbers. Surviving accounts vividly describe how these halls echoed at night with persistent coughing, snoring, and the distinct rustle of rough woolen blankets. The air was noticeably thick, cold, and damp, but the sheer press of bodies successfully meant the dormitory retained more warmth than an isolated chamber ever could. One persistent chronicler remarked that the cloister was actually warmer than the Lord's Tower, for the monks actively lay together like sheaves. In military life, the scene was noticeably harsher still. Soldiers actively billeted in castles or campaign encampments, aggressively crowded into barrack halls. Long rows of men were successfully stretched across straw beds, weapons meticulously stacked nearby. Blankets were universally shared and thick cloaks doubled as cover. The smell was pungent, sweat, leather, smoke, and straw actively mingling in a stew of humanity. Yet, for the deeply exhausted, even this rough camaraderie became bearable. To intentionally sleep shoulder to shoulder was to successfully survive the night. A fascinating, curious observation appears in the rules of certain nightly orders. Candles were purposefully kept burning in communal halls, not solely for light, but actively to comfort the men with flame. The glow successfully gave a psychological warmth, even if it entirely failed to raise the temperature significantly. The crucial symbolism of the flame mattered as much as its heat. Historians actively continue to debate whether communal sleeping was deliberately chosen for warmth or simply a byproduct of necessity. Some argue that the monasteries intentionally intended it as a form of discipline, a constant reminder that no monk had personal luxury. Others suggest the crucial warmth of shared space was a practical advantage that just happened to align with spiritual ideals. The same ambiguity consistently surrounds soldiers. Did they aggressively bunk together out of camaraderie, or precisely because the cold made solitude impossible? Likely it was both. Now vividly imagine yourself lying in one of these halls. The straw beneath you crackles noticeably as you shift. A neighbor coughs. Another turns. The sound is intensely amplified by the vaulted ceiling. The smell of smoke and sweat hangs heavy, but the air is noticeably less biting than in a solitary chamber. Your wool blanket scratches your chin, and you firmly tuck it tighter. You are grateful for the shared warmth, even as you desperately wish for silence. The rhythm of the dormitory is unmistakable. Snores dramatically rise and fall like waves, punctuated by the occasional murmur of a dream. Somewhere a rat quickly scurries across the rushes, completely ignored by men too weary to care. The persistent draft still seeps in through the high windows, but the collective body heat dulls its edge. You may not truly feel cozy, but you feel safe, noticeably safer than you would alone in a vast echoing stone room. Apprentices and household servants lived similarly. Castles were entirely filled with side chambers and lofts where young boys or maids successfully rolled out straw pallets, sometimes beneath staircases or inside storerooms. They successfully layered cloaks and huddled together, actively turning humble corners into makeshift bedrooms. Unlike nobles, they could not successfully command warming pans or featherbeds, but they possessed the crucial advantage of proximity. Their specific sleeping quarters were noticeably smaller, more crowded, and therefore warmer. The sensory experience of these communal spaces was truly unforgettable. Rough wool persistently against skin, the musky odor of bodies pressed close, the low hum of breathing, the distinct scratch of straw, the faint drip of water from the ceiling. It was certainly not peace in the modern sense, but it was fundamental endurance. People did not actively expect silence or solitude. They absolutely expected survival. So tonight, as you comfortably rest in your own bed, intentionally think of those long halls of monks, actively chanting prayers before extinguishing the lights, of soldiers collapsing in rows after a hard battle, of servants curling together in hidden corners. Their crucial warmth came not from silk or fur, but purely from each other. Sleep in medieval times was as much about community as about comfort. A constant reminder that even in the coldest castles, survival was rarely a solitary act. You've intentionally settled into this crowded dormitory in your imagination. But even here, crucial warmth isn't guaranteed. Fires absolutely must be tended. And in the depth of the night, someone always had to get up, patiently stumble across the floor, and actively stoke the embers. Medieval sleep was rarely completely uninterrupted. People woke frequently, not solely from the discomfort of straw or the coughs of neighbors, but from the profoundly practical necessity of keeping the fire alive. The medieval body clock was drastically different from ours. People didn't actively expect a straight 8 hours of rest. Instead, they actively lived with what some scholars call segmented sleep. The first sleep came after dusk, successfully lasting a few hours until midnight or so. Then many actively awoke, sometimes to specifically tend fires, sometimes to diligently pray, sometimes to actively check animals or children. After an hour or two of quiet wakefulness, they successfully returned to a second sleep until dawn. In the intensely freezing months, this brief break often intensely revolved around fire maintenance. Without it, embers quickly died and chambers subsequently became unbearable. One well-known record comes from the writings of a 15th-century physician who strongly recommended using the interval between first and second sleep for crucial reflection, conversation, or even intimacy. To him, this specific waking period was natural, but to the castle servant diligently trudging across icy floors to actively feed logs into a hearth, it was far less philosophy and far more duty. He patiently heard the crackle of fresh wood, desperately blew into the embers, and silently prayed they would catch. A fascinating, curious custom appears in some rural accounts. Families actively assigned watch duties, particularly in large halls. Each adult successfully took turns rising to check the fire. In monasteries, bells persistently rang at intervals throughout the night, actively calling monks to prayer and coincidentally successfully ensuring someone was always awake to mind the heat. Sleep was not a private withdrawal from the world, but a shared rhythm punctuated by responsibility. Historians actively debate whether segmented sleep was entirely universal or more common inside Northern Europe, where winter nights persistently stretched long. Some argue it was purely dictated by necessity. The mere length of darkness simply made a single stretch of sleep impractical. Others suggest it was a purely cultural habit, not entirely dependent on geography. The debate actively continues, but what remains fundamentally clear is that diligently tending the fire was at the very heart of these nighttime rhythms. Imagine yourself actively waking in the dead of night. The room is completely silent, but for various snores. You cautiously push back the blanket. You immediately feel the icy slap of air aggressively against your skin and anxiously fumble for a log. Your feet aggressively crunch on straw. Your breath rises in plumes, and your hands intensely sting as you stir the dying embers. Sparks quickly flare, logs reluctantly catch, and warmth actively pulses again into the room. You sigh with relief, intrinsically knowing that for a few more hours, your companions will successfully rest undisturbed. The sensory detail is unforgettable. The pop of wood, the faint glow pushing shadows back, the strong smell of smoke mingling with wool. Your fingers intensely ache, but the profound satisfaction of reviving the fire steadies you when you reluctantly crawl back beneath the blankets. The bed feels all the warmer. By noticeable contrast, peasants inside cottages actively lived by the same rhythm. Their hearths possessed no protective grates, only open flames positioned right on the floor. So a careless sleeper aggressively risked the fire, dying or worse, actively spreading. A family member always rose to adjust logs, poke embers, and diligently keep watch. Sleep came in fits and starts, always intrinsically tied to the heartbeat of the fire. And so you fully realize that medieval nights were not passive stretches of unconsciousness. They were actively negotiated, managed, and guarded. People actively rose, worked, prayed, checked on animals, whispered softly to loved ones, and then finally returned to slumber. Inside the darkness, life did not entirely pause. It simply noticeably slowed, consistently punctuated by firelight and breath. As you comfortably lie in your warm bed tonight, imagine the constant vigilance required inside those stone halls. To successfully close your eyes was never absolute. To successfully sleep was to consciously trust that someone would wake, feed the fire, and successfully keep the cold from claiming the room before dawn. You've diligently tended the fire, crawled back beneath the blankets, and desperately tried to steal your racing thoughts. Yet there existed another crucial medieval strategy for warmth, not entirely born of practicality, but purely of profound longing for luxury. For some, the powerful dream of a hot bath before bed persistently lingered like a forbidden indulgence. Bathing was incredibly complicated inside the Middle Ages. Successfully heating water aggressively required immense fuel, and tubs were large, cumbersome things. A genuinely warm soak was far from an everyday habit. It was solely a special event, and often completely communal, but for those who could genuinely afford it, successfully slipping into steaming water on a winter night was a distinct kind of magic. Chroniclers vividly describe noble women lowering themselves into wooden tubs, intentionally lined with cloth, steam actively curling up in the lamplight, attendants patiently standing by with warmed towels. To successfully step out of such a bath, and then gently slide between sheets was to briefly feel that winter had lost. A fascinating curious record from Paris clearly notes that wealthy citizens sometimes actively ordered tubs placed near fireplaces so that the bather intentionally emerged into a chamber already noticeably glowing with heat. The air noticeably smelled of rosemary or thyme, various herbs aggressively tossed into the water for fragrance and supposed medicinal benefit. For a short while, skin noticeably prickled with warmth, cheeks intensely flushed, and the body felt entirely prepared for restful sleep. Of course, such profound pleasures were rare. More often, people actively sought smaller comforts before bed. A cup of warm ale, spiced wine, or hot mead was a completely common indulgence. The heat successfully traveled inward, successfully spreading warmth through the chest, successfully lulling the body toward drowsiness. Some households successfully kept stones near the hearth, purposefully wrapped them in cloth, and strategically placed them at the foot of the bed, serving as primitive hot water bottles that successfully radiated heat for hours. One rather odd account vividly tells of noble families filling leather pouches with heated sand to carefully tuck between sheets. The sand successfully retained warmth longer than stones, and successfully conformed to the body's shape. Imagine intensely stretching your frozen feet towards such a pouch, softly sighing as the cold slowly eased. The underlying ingenuity is striking. When actively faced with hostile winters, people actively experimented with whatever materials they had. Modern historians still actively argue over just how common such bedtime luxuries were. Were they merely occasional treats for the very richest, or did middling families also actively practice them in modest form? Some strongly suggest that warming drinks and heated stones were widespread, completely accessible to most households. Others forcefully believe they remained rare indulgences, meticulously remembered precisely because they were unusual. The debate urgently reminds us that comfort itself was a contested privilege. Picture yourself inside this imagined chamber. You sit before the hearth as a servant, carefully pours mulled wine into a cup. The rich scent of cinnamon and cloves fills the air, successfully masking the odor of smoke and damp wool. You sip slowly, warmth actively blooming through your chest. Your eyes grow heavy. Your limbs loosen. And when you finally climb into bed, the blankets feel less oppressive, more inviting, as though the warmth already lives inside you. At the foot of the bed, a stone carefully wrapped in cloth radiates faint heat against your toes. For once, you do not dread the night. The sensory impressions are vivid. The sweet tang of spiced wine, the hiss of a log collapsing into embers, the prickling warmth of heated stone. You gently drift into slumber with your senses entirely saturated, your body actively convinced, however briefly, that comfort is possible. But here's the crucial truth. Such profound indulgences were fragile. Heat quickly faded. Drinks quickly cooled, and by midnight, the chamber was completely cold again. What these various rituals offered was not permanent relief, but a distinct kind of psychological grace, crucial moments of ease that successfully made the endless chill tolerable. So as you comfortably rest tonight, intentionally think of how deeply medieval people yearned for warmth. They meticulously engineered clever tools, actively sought fleeting indulgences, and successfully transformed even a hot drink into a strategy for survival. Their nights were not entirely effortless, but they were intensely resourceful. And every bath, every stone, every sip of ale was a small rebellion against the cold. Even after baths, heated stones, or mulled drinks, medieval people never solely relied on practical measures alone. Cold was not solely a physical enemy. It was a profoundly spiritual and supernatural one too. Night was dangerous. The air itself was actively suspected of harboring illness and various malevolent forces. And so, people intentionally turned to charms, rituals, and superstitions to successfully guard them as they slept. One commonly recorded practice was actively hanging amulets above the bed. These might be simple crosses carved from wood, small relics said to contain saintly power, or even herbs bound in little pouches. Rue, mugwort, and juniper were completely popular choices, widely believed to drive away not solely evil spirits, but also the night air wrongly thought to be poisonous. Imagine intensely lying in bed beneath a canopy, successfully strung with fragrant bundles, the strong scent mingling with the smoke of the hearth and the musk of wool blankets. Prayers were another shield. Monastic rules actively encouraged reciting psalms before lying down, and noble families often repeated paternosters or Ave Marias at the bedside. But even peasants consistently whispered charms, half prayer, half spell, as they successfully crossed themselves aggressively against frost or fever. Some gently murmured verses over children, actively pressing kisses on their foreheads to keep the night hag away, a terrifying figure specifically blamed for suffocating sleepers. A fascinating curious detail appears in a German household manual from the 15th century. Sleepers were actively advised to place iron objects such as a knife or scissors beneath the bed or pillow. Iron was widely thought to repel demons and fairies that aggressively slipped into rooms during the long hours of darkness. The metal successfully glinted faintly in the firelight, a silent guard against unseen intruders. And then there existed various rituals tied directly to warmth. One folk belief forcefully insisted that turning your shoes upside down right beside the bed would successfully keep frost from biting your toes. Another claimed that if you precisely whispered the names of 3 saints before successfully blowing out the candle, your crucial body heat would not flee in the night. To us, these solely sound like quaint superstitions. To them they were strategies as completely vital as an extra blanket. Scholars actively remain divided on how seriously people genuinely took such practices. Some argue that charms and prayers were completely heartfelt, deeply ingrained in the rhythm of daily life. Others suggest they were far more like habits, simple gestures performed out of custom, even if not fully believed. Either way, the rituals consistently reveal something essential. Sleep was never trusted. It was a vulnerable state where cold, illness, and spirits could all aggressively strike. People crucially needed both physical and spiritual defenses. Picture yourself now actively lying in a medieval bed. The curtains are securely drawn, the fire is consistently low, and the chamber is actively filled with shadows. Above you actively hangs a sprig of juniper, its sharp scent cutting through the smoky air. Beneath your pillow actively rests a small iron knife, hidden but fundamentally comforting. You quietly whisper a prayer, words soft and rhythmic, and then successfully cross yourself before actively pulling the blankets tighter. The night feels noticeably less menacing, as though the rituals have successfully carved a circle of safety all around your fragile body. The sensory details deepen the experience. The rustle of herbs gently brushing against the canopy, the faint metallic smell of iron near your head, the comforting warmth of wool against your skin, and the lingering echo of whispered words. In that specific moment, faith, superstition, and survival are all intensely intertwined. Peasants actively practiced the same, though with different materials. Instead of precious relics, they successfully hung crude charms, carved wooden figures, knotted cords, or simple herbs gathered from fields. Parents successfully tucked garlic under children's pillows, genuinely believing it warded off both sickness and spirits. Even animals were completely included. Cows and sheep in barns were sometimes blessed before nightfall, their presence widely thought to strengthen the household against frost. In every single class of society, the cold night was not solely endured with cloth and fire, but with ritual. The medieval mind actively sought warmth in the body and safety in the unseen. To successfully sleep was to actively step into mystery, where prayer and herb, iron and flame all consistently worked together aggressively against the long darkness. So when you successfully tuck yourself into bed tonight, imagine those little gestures, the intentionally flipped shoes, the sprig of rosemary, the quietly whispered saint's name. They were small comforts, no less real for being intangible. For the medieval sleeper, survival was never purely physical. It was also profound spiritual armor, intricately woven from faith, habit, and hope. Step back entirely from the bed itself, and intensely look at the chamber as a whole. Beyond numerous blankets, loyal dogs, or various charms, the architecture of a room shaped how well its occupants could endure the night. Castles were deliberately built first for defense, but over passing time, builders actively experimented with ways to make the interiors more livable. The resulting result was a patchwork of features, some clever, some symbolic, that actively aimed to carve warmth out of stone. One such feature was the solar, a private room often specifically set aside for the lord and his family. Unlike the cavernous Great Hall, the solar was smaller, higher in the building, and noticeably easier to heat. It usually possessed its own fireplace, thick hangings on the walls and windows actively facing the sun. This wasn't luxury in the modern sense. It was pure strategy. By successfully reducing the size of the room, the fire's heat possessed a fighting chance of lingering. Tapestries became more than decoration. Woven from wool or silk, they actively lined the walls with color and stories. Saints, hunts, mythical beasts, but they also profoundly served as insulation. A tapestry might easily be 10 or 20 feet wide, heavy enough that servants aggressively struggled to hang it. Behind it, the damp stone was successfully hidden, and the air positioned near the wall grew a little less icy. Step incredibly close to one, and you could even clearly smell the lanolin of the wool, earthy and faintly comforting. Archaeological surveys consistently show that many chambers had wooden paneling installed for precisely the same reason. Oak boards successfully created a buffer zone, actively trapping pockets of air and successfully making the space feel less like a cave. Servants actively stuffed gaps with tow, moss, or rags to successfully stop drafts. The resulting result was imperfect, but it vividly demonstrated the lengths people went to successfully transform inhospitable fortresses into homes. A fascinating, curious detail emerges in estate accounts. Nobles frequently moved their most prized tapestries from castle to castle, actively carrying them like portable walls. They weren't solely art, they were essential survival gear. A lord traveling completely without his hangings was profoundly like a soldier without armor. Specialists in medieval domestic life still actively argue over just how effective these architectural features were. Some genuinely believe they reduced drafts and successfully retained heat. Others forcefully insist the psychological comfort mattered more than the physical difference. Walking into a chamber successfully hung with brilliant cloth and noticeably glowing with firelight might genuinely feel warmer, even if the actual temperature barely changed. That crucial debate underscores the subtle interplay between perception and survival. Now vividly picture yourself stepping into such a room. The door securely closes behind you, actively muting the howl of the wind rushing from the corridor. The walls are meticulously draped with crimson and gold tapestries, their woven figures half-lit by candlelight. The fire gently flickers in a carved stone hearth, smoke actively twisting upward. Above you, the timber ceiling seems lower than in the great hall, the space noticeably more intimate. It is still undeniably cold. You visibly see your breath in the air, but noticeably less hostile than the open chambers positioned below. The sensory impression is layered, the rough weave of tapestry beneath your hand, the faint smell of wool mixed with smoke, the sound of fire aggressively snapping against oak logs. You can almost genuinely believe this room is a refuge, though the persistent cold lurks just beyond the hangings. Peasants successfully mimicked the same strategy in a simpler form. Instead of intricately woven tapestries, they actively plastered or waddle-lined their walls, then successfully hung coarse wool or patched cloth to successfully reduce drafts. A brightly painted cloth with simple patterns might successfully double as insulation and decoration. In their own unique way, peasants also successfully turned bare walls into protective shells, successfully shrinking the space into something entirely habitable. Another subtle architectural trick was the strategic placement of sleeping chambers on upper floors. Rising heat, emanating from the great hall positioned below, successfully gave at least a slight advantage. Children sometimes successfully slept in lofts above kitchens, where warmth radiating from ovens persistently lingered. The entire arrangement was far less about privacy, and far more about exploiting every stray degree of heat. And yet, despite all these diligent efforts, the cold never entirely vanished. You could only successfully mitigate, never entirely eliminate its grip. Still, the simple presence of wall hangings, solar chambers, and wooden panels clearly shows how profoundly people longed to successfully transform stone prisons into dwellings. So as you comfortably rest tonight, imagine those rooms visibly glowing with tapestries, warmed faintly by fires, softened by wooden boards and bright cloth. They were not entirely cozy by our modern standards, but they were intentional gestures of defiance. Aggressively against the stone, against the frost, aggressively against the endless winter night, the medieval household intentionally built layers, architectural, artistic, and psychological, to definitively say, this space is ours, and here at least we will endure. Close your eyes and vividly imagine the smell of a medieval bedroom. It wasn't the lavender-scented idyll of modern linen adverts. Instead, it was a dense stew of odor actively layered from the very moment you walked through the heavy wooden door. To truly understand how people slept, you absolutely have to understand what they smelled, because every single breath persistently reminded them of the conditions in which they actively lived. The first scent was always smoke. Fires actively burned almost constantly in winter, and without efficient chimneys, the soot relentlessly drifted back into the room. The walls noticeably darkened, the air aggressively grew heavy, and the smell successfully embedded itself in the very fibers of blankets and curtains. Even freshly laundered linen soon carried the tang of ash. You'd lie down at night with smoke clinging to your hair, your clothes, even your exposed skin. Next came the strong scent of damp wool. Blankets, cloaks, and clothing were rarely truly dry in winter. Moisture continuously crept through stone walls, actively condensed on surfaces, and completely soaked into textiles. Wool successfully holds that damp smell stubbornly, earthy, lanolene, rich, faintly sour. Imagine pulling the covers up to your chin and actively inhaling fabric that felt warm but never completely fresh. Add to this the distinct odor of straw and rushes. Floors were entirely covered with them, beds were densely stuffed with them, and they rarely successfully stayed clean. They were continuously trampled by boots, soaked with spills, and persistently colonized by mice. Rushes quickly turned musty. Straw mattresses initially released grassy scents at first, but after weeks of intense use, they smelled intensely of sweat and decay. Each simple shift in bed released another puff of that earthy smell into the air. One fascinating curious note in a 14th century household manual strongly recommended sprinkling dried herbs, rosemary, lavender, or meadowsweet, aggressively onto rushes to sweeten the chamber. For a few days it successfully worked. The fragrance noticeably mingled with the heavier odor, successfully masking them just enough to seem civilized. But soon the herbs wilted, aggressively crushed beneath feet, their scent actively fading into the background, while the sourness of old rushes relentlessly returned. Then there existed the intense human smell. Hygiene was incredibly limited, baths were actively infrequent, and sweat was constant. People successfully slept in layers of clothing that completely absorbed the day's odor. Leather, wool, unwashed skin. Beds successfully shared by families or companions compounded this. Actively breathing the air of a medieval chamber meant actively inhaling the scent of other bodies, sometimes comforting, sometimes truly suffocating. Scholars actively debate just how overwhelming these smells truly were. Some argue that medieval people, completely accustomed to constant exposure, barely noticeably noticed. Others genuinely believe contemporaries were very much aware, which is precisely why they highly valued herbs, perfumes, and incense so highly. Evidence gleaned from inventories and medical texts strongly suggests the latter. People openly complained of foul air, actively sought remedies, and consciously took steps to counteract it. The debate itself reminds us that smell was not secondary. It was intensely central to the medieval experience of sleep. Now vividly place yourself in such a room. The fire has noticeably burned low, solely leaving only the bitter tang of smoke. The damp wool blanket itches your chin. Straw positioned beneath you actively releases a musty breath each time you shift. The rushes on the floor softly rustle faintly as various mice quickly scurry through crumbs. Your companion positioned beside you exhales, warm but heavily laden with sweat and ale. Above it all floats a faint trace of rosemary strategically sprinkled days ago, now barely successfully masking the stew of odor. The sensory reality is overwhelming. It aggressively presses into your nose and lungs, successfully embedding itself into memory. You cough, adjust the covers, and desperately try to breathe shallowly until sleep finally comes. This was entirely normal. This was simply life. Peasants experienced precisely the same, though on a smaller scale. Their cottages were actively filled with the smell of livestock since domestic animals frequently shared the same structure. Cows, sheep, and chickens actively contributed their odor, successfully creating a pungent mixture that city travelers found utterly unbearable, but villagers simply accepted as part of survival. Yet, even here, herbs were continuously used. Bunches of mint or chamomile might successfully hang from rafters, partly for fragrance, partly to successfully ward off pests. For nobles, perfumes and incense occasionally improved matters. Incense actively burned in braziers successfully added sweetness to the air, though it successfully mingled oddly with smoke and damp. Perfumed oils gently dabbed on clothes or linens successfully created pockets of pleasant scent in an otherwise heavy atmosphere. But even the richest chamber could not entirely escape the fundamental odor of medieval life. So when you actively imagine sleeping in a castle, do not solely picture crisp linen and fresh air. Picture instead a true medley of smoke, damp wool, straw, sweat, herbs, and animals. Every passing night, every single breath persistently reminded you of where you lived and what you truly endured. Smell was as much a fundamental part of medieval sleep as blankets or fire. And perhaps over sufficient time the very familiarity of those odors brought a kind of comfort. To actively breathe smoke and wool and straw was to actively breathe home. For the medieval sleeper, scent was not solely inconvenience. It was inherent identity, intricately woven into every night's dream. After the smoke, damp wool, and musty straw, another potent force helped medieval people survive the night. Food and drink. You might not immediately think of supper as part of sleep, but what you actively ate before bed, and what crucial warmth it gave inside your body, consistently mattered as much as any blanket. In winter, households strictly leaned on hearty pottages, thick stews composed of barley, peas, and root vegetables successfully simmered slowly in great cauldrons. These dense meals tenaciously clung to the body, successfully leaving a heavy fullness that successfully made the cold easier to bear. The crucial heat of the broth lingered inside the stomach, successfully spreading outward, actively convincing you that you could endure a freezing chamber a little longer. A noble household might successfully enrich the dish with meat, spices, or cream, while peasants purely relied on onions, cabbage, and whatever meager scraps were available. One fascinating curious note in a 15th century English manuscript actively advises eating leeks at night, precisely because they successfully warm the belly and successfully chase away the chill of death. Whether or not that specific claim held true, it clearly shows how strongly people linked diet with warmth and survival. A hot meal was not solely nourishment. It was crucial insulation from the inside out. Drinks played an equally significant role. Ale was the single most common beverage. It was readily consumed by rich and poor alike. It was frequently served warm in winter. It successfully filled bellies with calories and successfully provided liquid comfort. Spiced wine, or hippocras, became a noble favorite. It was successfully heated gently and carefully, seasoned with cinnamon, ginger, and cloves, actively imported from faraway lands. Imagine gently sipping such a drink inside a smoky chamber, the strong aroma of exotic spices mingling with wool and ash, the sweetness actively burning in your throat, successfully leaving you drowsy and warm. There's even a fascinating record from the court of Charles VI of France, where the king's physician strongly recommended hot mead at night to successfully prevent chill from entering the bones. The underlying idea was not far from our modern habit of simply drinking tea before bed, though medieval science completely wrapped it in humoral theory, the prevailing belief that warm, moist drinks successfully balance the body's inner fluids. Scholars still actively debate how much alcohol contributed to warmth versus simply successfully giving the illusion of it. Some argue that ale and wine purely dulled perception, successfully making sleepers believe they were warmer than they truly were. Others consistently point to the real caloric benefit of these drinks, which did successfully provide energy through long cold nights. The truth may be situated somewhere in between, a combination of genuine warmth and psychological comfort. Now vividly imagine yourself preparing for bed. A servant successfully hands you a wooden cup of mulled wine. The surface actively steams, successfully sending waves of spiced aroma into your nose. You drink, the liquid noticeably glowing as it slips down your throat. Your body gently relaxes, muscles gently loosening, eyelids growing heavy. When you finally climb into bed, the blankets feel less oppressive, more inviting, as though the warmth already lives inside you. At the foot of the bed, a stone successfully wrapped in cloth radiates faint heat aggressively against your toes. For once, you do not dread the night. The sensory impressions are vivid, the sweet tang of spiced wine, the hiss of a log collapsing into embers, the prickling warmth of heated stone. You gently drift into slumber with your senses entirely saturated, your body completely convinced, however briefly, that comfort is possible. But here's the crucial truth. Such profound indulgences were fragile. Heat quickly faded, drinks quickly cooled, and by midnight, the chamber was completely cold again. What these various rituals offered was not permanent relief, but a distinct kind of psychological grace, crucial moments of ease that successfully made the endless chill tolerable. So as you comfortably rest tonight, intentionally think of how deeply medieval people yearned for warmth. They meticulously engineered clever tools, actively sought fleeting indulgences, and successfully transformed even a hot drink into a strategy for survival. Their nights were not entirely effortless, but they were intensely resourceful. And every spoonful, every swallow, was another layer of defense, an inner blanket, invisible but essential, aggressively against the freezing stone around you. Think now of the absolute most vulnerable people inside a medieval castle. The children and the elderly. Their bodies, noticeably less resilient to cold, often actively bore the brunt of winter's cruelty. If a healthy adult knight or servant shivered through the night, a child might aggressively wake blue-lipped, and an old woman might not wake at all. Survival for these specific groups significantly depended on extra care, communal support, and sometimes sheer luck. Household records meticulously preserved from noble families clearly show that children were rarely given their own chambers. Instead, they successfully slept in nurseries positioned close to the warmth of kitchens or successfully clustered with servants. Young pages and squires specifically destined for training often aggressively bunked together in crowded rooms, their laughter and chatter successfully muffled by blankets at night. The underlying logic was simple. More bodies meant more heat. Babies especially were meticulously swaddled in layer after layer of linen and wool. A cradle was strategically stood near the hearth, or in some specific cases directly inside the bed of the mother, where her crucial body heat shielded the infant from the freezing air. One poignant account from a 14th century chronicle vividly describes a noble child laid by the fire in a wicker crib, meticulously wrapped in furs and successfully covered with a canopy. The detail strongly suggests the lengths families went to successfully protect their youngest. Yet even so, illness and cold relentlessly claimed many lives. Medieval parents actively lived with constant fear that winter might suddenly take a child in the night. The elderly faced similar perils. Frail bodies successfully produced less heat and consistently tolerated fewer drafts. In peasant cottages, grandparents often successfully slept closest to the fire, while younger adults reluctantly accepted colder spots. In castles, aged relatives were strategically placed in smaller chambers, or even actively moved into kitchens during the absolute coldest months. A fascinating, curious letter from Burgundy vividly tells of an elderly matron who forcefully insisted on sleeping in the bakehouse, convincingly arguing that the oven's residual warmth successfully gave her a second youth. Medical texts of the period often actively advised special measures for the old and young. Physicians strongly recommended heated stones carefully wrapped in cloth to be strategically placed at their feet, or mulled drinks to successfully fortify the humors. They strongly warned that sudden chills could entirely extinguish the flame of life, a vivid reminder of how vulnerable these groups were. Historians actively continue to discuss whether medieval families actively treated children and elders with extra indulgence, or simply successfully folded them into the same survival strategies as everyone else. Some argue that the intense emphasis on protecting them reflects deep compassion. Others precisely point out that mortality rates remained high, strongly suggesting limits to what families could realistically do. The crucial tension between care and inevitability shaped how people viewed age and childhood. Now, vividly imagine the scene of a winter's night inside a peasant cottage. A baby actively lies swaddled tightly, his tiny face barely visible. A grandmother softly snores, softly by the hearth, the faint glow of embers painting her cheeks red. Parents strategically tuck cloaks over both, successfully ensuring they receive the warmest spots. Children aggressively crowd together on a straw mattress, gently giggling until exhaustion silences them. The chamber noticeably smells of porridge, smoke, and wool, but the warmth of family togetherness lingers. Inside a castle, the visual image is drastically different, but no less vivid. A nursemaid gently rocks a cradle near the fire, softly humming, while a child whimpers against the chill. Upstairs, an elderly noblewoman forcefully insists her bed curtains be drawn tight, while a servant successfully places hot stones at her feet. She quietly mutters prayers, tenaciously clutching a rosary, intensely fearful of the cold's creeping hand. In both worlds, the youngest and oldest consistently require the most attention, and sometimes even that isn't entirely enough. The sensory detail is striking. The loud crackle of logs as they're diligently added to the fire. The soft rustle of swaddling cloth. The quiet groans of an old man adjusting under blankets. You actively feel the fragility in the air, as though the cold actively waits for a moment of weakness to strike. So when you actively think of medieval sleep, remember that it was not entirely equal for all. Children and elders consistently carried the heaviest risks, their survival entirely dependent on the warmth provided by others. In those long nights, every blanket, every ember, every whispered prayer truly mattered. They vividly remind us that medieval sleep was not solely about individual endurance, but about community, the young and old, successfully carried through winter by the dedicated care and vigilance of those around them. The cold didn't just gnaw at skin and bone. It fundamentally shaped how people thought about health itself. To a medieval mind, chill wasn't solely uncomfortable. It was genuinely dangerous. A powerful force that could aggressively warp the body's inner balance and actively invite disease. Medicine in this specific era fundamentally revolved around the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And physicians strongly believed temperature played a vital role in successfully keeping those fluids in harmony. Too much cold, and your humors successfully congealed, aggressively clogging the body and successfully making you ill. Medical treatises meticulously preserved from the 13th and 14th centuries are actively filled with advice on successfully combating this problem at night. One manual strongly suggested rubbing feet with warm oil before bed to successfully open the pores and actively expel the harmful chill. Another forcefully recommended drinking heated milk with honey, genuinely claiming it soothed the stomach and successfully kept the humors from turning sluggish. Physicians consistently viewed warmth as medicine in itself, diligently prescribing heat in every form: food, drink, clothing, and even proximity to others. There's a truly fascinating record from a French surgeon who urgently warned that sleeping in damp chambers could actively breed melancholy by actively chilling the black bile. He strongly advised hanging tapestries not solely for beauty, but for genuine medical necessity. Imagine being specifically told by your doctor that failing to decorate your walls properly might actively make you depressed. It clearly shows how deeply climate and medicine were intertwined. At the exact same time, folk cures intensely flourished. Some people genuinely believed rubbing garlic or onion on the soles of the feet before sleep successfully prevented chills from entering the body. Others successfully tied charms of wool, soaked in wine, around their wrists. A fascinating, curious prescription from an English herbal actively advises keeping a live rooster in the bedroom to successfully draw away the frost from man. Whether anyone truly slept with a squawking chicken nearby is uncertain, but the underlying belief successfully reveals just how desperate people were for remedies. Modern scholars still actively debate how effective medieval health practices aggressively against cold really were. Some argue that oils, heated drinks, and herbal remedies did successfully provide modest relief, successfully easing circulation, and successfully offering psychological comfort. Others forcefully insist most of these treatments were purely symbolic, successfully offering little real benefit beyond placebo. The disagreement actively continues. But what's absolutely certain is that people believed wholeheartedly in the power of these nightly rituals. Now, vividly imagine yourself preparing for bed under such fervent advice. You sit by the hearth while a servant carefully massages warm oil into your feet, the smell of rosemary filling the chamber. You drink a small cup of heated wine actively sweetened with honey, and visibly feel it coat your throat. A sprig of garlic actively rests near the bed, pungent and strange, purposefully meant to ward off frost. You climb into bed, actively convinced that these remedies will successfully keep your humors balanced until morning. The sensory experience is intense. The slick warmth of oil on your skin, the sweet tang of honeyed wine, the acrid bite of garlic in the air. Every single detail urgently reminds you that sleep was not solely a battle against discomfort, but a medical practice, a nightly therapy aggressively against the threat of imbalance. Peasants, too, possessed their own remedies. Women actively brewed herbal teas of nettle or chamomile for children, genuinely believing the warmth prevented coughs. Men successfully wrapped their legs in wool soaked in vinegar to successfully keep circulation strong. Inside cottages, these specific practices actively blurred the line between superstition and science. But they successfully gave people agency in a world where illness often felt inevitable. The irony, of course, is that many ailments successfully came from the very strategies actively used to combat cold. Fires aggressively filled lungs with smoke, heavy blankets actively triggered joint pain, and oily ointments persistently collected dirt. Yet to medieval minds these were purely minor costs compared to the greater peril of frost seeping into the body. Better to cough in a smoky room than freeze in a clean one. So when you actively picture medieval sleep, remember it wasn't solely a matter of enduring discomfort. It was entirely wrapped in theories of health, remedies both strange and familiar, and a constant anxiety that cold might aggressively tip the balance of life itself. Every night was a medical event. Every blanket and herb a prescription, every ember a treatment, and to gently drift into slumber was to consciously trust that these efforts were entirely enough to carry you through until morning. Even with numerous fires, blankets, herbs, and charms, there were specific nights when none of it was enough. Step inside a castle chamber at the height of winter, and you might clearly see something uncanny, frost blooming on the inside walls. Imagine intensely lying in bed, and clearly noticing a delicate lace of ice, actively tracing the stones, or successfully waking to find your wash basin frozen solid. The water inside was successfully turned to a glassy block. The cold didn't politely stay outdoors. It aggressively invaded, successfully decorating rooms with its own cruel artistry. Chroniclers actively record moments when entire households aggressively woke to frost on their bed curtains. One noble woman actively wrote in a letter that her canopy noticeably glittered, as though intentionally sewn with silver, clearly meaning the moisture from her own breath had successfully crystallized overnight. To us, it solely sounds poetic. To her it was profoundly miserable proof of how entirely inhospitable even a well-furnished chamber could be. Archaeological evidence strongly supports these accounts. In certain meticulously preserved castles, faint salt streaks and moisture stains strongly suggest how water condensed on walls and floors. Without insulation, warm indoor air aggressively met freezing stone, and frost tenaciously took hold. Servants diligently scraped ice away in the mornings, only for it to relentlessly return each night. A fascinating, curious anecdote survives from Scandinavia. In some specific halls, actual icicles formed on rafters indoors, constantly dripping onto unlucky sleepers positioned below. Servants successfully hung cloths to catch the meltwater, a primitive solution to an unnerving problem. Imagine gently drifting off and clearly hearing the faint crack of ice positioned above, nervously wondering if a shard would fall onto your bed. Scholars still actively discuss how common this phenomenon was. Some genuinely believe frost indoors was typical only of Northern Europe, where winters were noticeably harsher. Others argue that even in temperate regions, poorly heated stone chambers easily reached freezing temperatures. The truth may be both. Severity actively varied by region, but the distinct risk of waking to ice inside your room was never far away. Now vividly put yourself in that situation. You wake in the dim grey of dawn, breath intensely fogging in the air. The bed curtains are noticeably stiff, delicately edged with frozen crystals. When you actively reach for the wash basin, your fingers physically touch ice instead of water. Your joints intensely ache from the cold, and the very thought of leaving the covers feels profoundly like punishment. The sensory detail is vivid, the sharp sting of frozen fabric aggressively against your skin, the brittle creak of wood actively shrunk by frost, the silence successfully broken only by the faint drip of melting ice. Peasants actively lived with the same problem, though in drastically different forms. Inside cottages, frost coated the inside of thatch and rafters, successfully drifting down like snow during the night. Children sometimes woke with frost clinging to their hair. Parents joked grimly about sleeping with the clouds indoors. Yet humor could not entirely disguise the hardship. Frostbite, chilblains, and respiratory illness relentlessly followed in its wake. Nobles, despite their considerable wealth, couldn't entirely escape it. Hot stones and furs successfully kept the body alive, but the surrounding air consistently remained hostile. Diaries hint at the intense psychological toll. People openly spoke of dreading the moment they had to actively leave bed in the morning, of genuinely feeling imprisoned by blankets because the room beyond was far too cruel to face. One English poet even successfully turned it into metaphor, actively writing of love as a bed without frost inside the hangings. For him, true intimacy profoundly meant defying the nightly chill, successfully creating warmth where the world solely offered only ice. It clearly reveals how deeply the experience of frost shaped imagination, as well as reality. So, as you actively think of medieval sleep, remember the surreal beauty of those nights when cold successfully decorated the very walls. To actively live in a castle was to successfully share your chamber with ice. To actively wake each morning reminded that stone and frost were crucial allies against your comfort. And yet people successfully endured, diligently scraping ice away, layering blankets, quietly whispering prayers, and bravely braving mornings that felt as harsh indoors as out. Picture yourself not solely in a castle this time, but on the road, positioned far from familiar chambers. Medieval travel was slow, arduous, and inherently dangerous. And when night aggressively fell, the specific problem of warmth became even more acute. Castles possessed their numerous fireplaces and tapestries. Peasants possessed their numerous family hearths, but travelers, pilgrims, merchants, wandering knights were entirely forced to seek shelter wherever they could successfully find it, and that usually solely meant inns. The medieval inn was not the cozy picture postcard you might readily imagine. Instead, it was often a simple timber structure with a smoky hall, intensely crowded rooms, and numerous beds shared by strangers. Guests might be actively packed, 3 or 4 to a mattress, blankets were intensely stretched thin, and personal privacy was non-existent. Still, inns successfully provided one crucial thing: heat. The main hall fire actively blazed for everyone, and bodies aggressively crowded together multiplied warmth. One traveller in 15th century Italy openly complained that the beds were alive with vermin, but openly admitted that at least the company of fellow guests successfully meant he did not freeze. Imagine reluctantly crawling into a straw mattress, aggressively squeezing beside two strangers, the smell of ale and sweat filling your nostrils. Unpleasant, yes, but at least your toes survived the night. There existed odder accommodations too. Some inns were so poorly equipped that guests actively slept in stables. At first glance, this solely seems degrading, but travelers sometimes genuinely preferred it. Horses and cattle actively radiated warmth, and a stable aggressively packed with animals could be far cozier than a drafty upstairs room. Pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago occasionally wrote of choosing stalls on purpose, actively curling up against hay bales with livestock, their breath noticeably mingling with the animals. The odor was incredibly strong, but the crucial heat was undeniable. In more rural areas, hospitality consistently followed older traditions. Villagers were actively expected to open their doors to travelers, especially pilgrims or those successfully carrying religious tokens. A peasant family might successfully offer a spot by the fire or space on a straw pallet. Warmth here successfully came, not from luxury, but purely from generosity and closeness. You'd sleep shoulder to shoulder with strangers, intently listening to the crackle of a humble hearth, the smell of stew still persistently lingering in the rafters. A fascinating curious record from a 14th century French town vividly describes communal inns where long wooden platforms were actively laid out, successfully covered in straw, and dozens of travelers actively lay side by side, men and women alike. The very idea of strangers pressed together might certainly unsettle us today, but then it was completely normal. Shared warmth consistently outweighed any awkwardness. Scholars actively discuss whether such inns offered more comfort than castles. Some argue yes, though crowded and unhygienic, they successfully retained warmth better than vast noble chambers. Others precisely point to the dangers, lice, fleas, theft, and strongly suggest that castle life, for all its cold, at least successfully offered safety. Both perspectives are completely valid. For the weary medieval traveller, survival often actively meant choosing between cold isolation and crowded discomfort. Now, vividly imagine yourself in one of these inns. You enter the hall, successfully greeted by the roar of voices and fire. The smell of ale, smoke, and roasted meat envelops you. You are successfully cleared a space on a straw pallet, and you aggressively squeeze in beside strangers. The floor loudly creaks, dogs bark, mugs clatter, and yet the warmth of the crowd successfully makes your limbs relax. Later, when the hall gradually quiets and snores successfully replace laughter, you actively feel the heat of bodies pressed close, the embers noticeably glowing faintly in the hearth. It is not comfort as you intrinsically know it, but it is entirely enough. The sensory details are striking. The scratch of straw successfully through thin linen, the heavy scent of sweat and smoke, the rhythmic breathing of a dozen sleepers. You shift, desperately trying not to disturb your neighbor, and eventually the murmur of the inn lulls you into a shallow but necessary sleep. Even nobles actively faced this reality when traveling. Royal progressions absolutely required armies of attendants, and inns quickly overflowed. Records vividly describe monarchs lodging in monasteries or aggressively commandeering entire households for their retinues. But even kings could not successfully escape the fundamental challenge. Warmth was scarce, and the road successfully stripped away layers of privilege. So in the crucial tapestry of medieval sleep, remember the traveller. For him, each single night was uncertain, each bed a gamble. Would it be a flea-ridden pallet, a stable with horses, a stranger's cottage floor, or if fortune truly smiled, a monastery guest hall? Wherever it was, the precise same goal remained: to successfully trap enough warmth to successfully see another dawn. Every household successfully found ways to endure, but not every single person successfully succeeded. The medieval world successfully left behind stories, half history, half legend, of those who actively faced nights so cold, they subsequently became the stuff of cautionary tales. To actively sleep in a castle was to desperately fight an invisible enemy, and sometimes the cold actively won. One grim chronicle from the 13th century vividly tells of guards posted on a castle wall inside Flanders, who actively froze at their posts during a bitter winter siege. By dawn their comrades successfully found them still upright, spears in hand, their bodies stiff with ice, The chronicler actively noted it, not as simple tragedy, but as profound proof of winter's cruelty, as though the cold itself were solely a weapon of war. Imagine the truly eerie sight. Men completely transformed into statues overnight, their crucial watchfires long extinguished. There existed softer, more personal tales as well. A letter from a noble woman inside Burgundy actively recounts how her cousin, specifically visiting from Italy, relentlessly trembled all the night and aggressively begged for dawn, for he had completely never known such frost. The man successfully survived, but the story was continuously retold with laughter, actively mocking him for his weakness, while quietly acknowledging the terror of a night that seemed utterly endless. A fascinating, curious folk story from Scandinavia specifically speaks of a bride who successfully entered her new husband's castle only to successfully collapse from the shock of the cold chamber. Villagers quietly whispered that she had been actively cursed by the ice spirits of the north. Whether she actively died from illness or simply from brutal exposure, the entire tale lived on as a warning. Even noble marriages could be actively tested by stone walls and winter winds. Scholars actively remain divided on how literally we should actively take these accounts. Were they noticeably exaggerated for drama, successfully turning ordinary hardship into legend? Or do they genuinely reflect real devastating losses to frostbite and hypothermia in an age completely without insulation? Some genuinely believe chroniclers inflated stories for moral lessons, while others solely see them as accurate records of a climate noticeably harsher than ours today. Now vividly imagine yourself hearing such tales inside a great hall. The fire noticeably burns low. Shadows actively dance on the walls. And an old retainer actively tells the story of a knight who tragically perished in his sleep precisely because he trusted too few blankets. Children intently listen wide-eyed, tenaciously clutching their cloaks tighter. These various stories serve not solely as entertainment, but as urgent warnings. Take the cold seriously, or it will successfully take you. Even travelers' accounts sometimes actively carried this tone of caution. Pilgrims actively wrote of companions lost on treacherous mountain passes, their bodies successfully discovered in spring, entirely curled as if still asleep. Soldiers on campaign vividly described comrades who never actively rose from their bedrolls, their cloaks noticeably stiff with frost. The crucial line between sleep and death blurred too easily when temperatures aggressively dropped. The sensory details of such nights are chilling. The sting of frost aggressively on bare skin. The intense numbness creeping through fingers and toes. The profound dread of closing your eyes and not successfully opening them again. To lie down in a freezing chamber was to actively gamble. Blankets, fires and prayers were the crucial stakes. Survival was the absolute prize. But alongside these grim tales, there were also various stories of endurance. Peasants successfully boasted of winters survived inside humble cottages, where closeness and fire successfully kept families alive. Nobles actively celebrated hunts and feasts in midwinter, clear proof that their wealth conquered the season. For every single account of loss, there existed voices actively declaring resilience, successfully framing survival itself as a kind of victory. Perhaps that is precisely why legends of freezing nights persistently persisted. They urgently reminded listeners that castles, for all their strength, were not entirely invulnerable. Stone walls successfully kept out armies, but absolutely not winter. And in the long dark hours, even the mightiest lord entirely depended on blankets, fires and companions, precisely just like the humblest peasant. So, as you actively imagine medieval sleep, successfully hold both truths together. The stories of those who actively succumbed to frost, and the quiet triumphs of those who endured. Every single tale actively carried a lesson. Respect the night. Guard against the cold, and never entirely assume survival was guaranteed. At last you reluctantly returned to the hearth, the profound symbol that successfully held every medieval sleeper in its glow. The fire was never solely a tool. It was the absolute heart of the household, the crucial boundary between life and death on winter nights. Its light successfully cast shadows across the walls, shadows that noticeably seemed to move like guardians, actively flickering and shifting as the flames dramatically rose and fell. To actively sleep in a castle was to actively live in a dialogue with fire. You feared it. You crucially needed it. You absolutely could not survive without it. The hearth's constant presence dominated every sense. The snap of oak logs echoed like a heartbeat in the chamber. Sparks successfully leapt upward, successfully leaving faint trails of light before completely vanishing into the chimney. The smell of burning resin clung to tapestries and hair. Heat successfully radiated in uneven waves, aggressively baking your face while your back froze. The hearth was a distinct paradox, both savior and tormentor, life-giver and smoky tyrant. Nobles actively celebrated fire as a mark of status. A fiercely blazing hearth meant wealth, the distinct ability to command servants to meticulously gather endless fuel, to aggressively strip forests if necessary, to successfully keep flames alive through the night. Some households even successfully employed dedicated fire wardens, servants whose sole duty was to successfully ensure that embers never died. To consciously let the hearth grow cold was more than simple inconvenience, it was a complete disgrace. Yet the poorest also actively gathered around their humble fires with the exact same reverence. Peasants successfully squatted on earthen floors, successfully huddled with family and livestock, intently watching flames lick at rough logs. They laughed, successfully told stories, prayed, and successfully passed bowls of stew. Theirs was not the grandeur of intricately carved stone hearths, but the crucial comfort was no less real. In both castle and cottage, fire successfully drew people together and successfully made sleep possible. A fascinating, curious account from a traveler in Germany vividly describes villagers circling the hearth and actively stretching their hands toward it before bed, quietly whispering blessings as though the flames themselves were entirely sacred. They genuinely believed the fire carried their hopes into the night, successfully protecting them as they slept. It clearly reveals how practical necessity blurred into ritual. The fire was not solely warmth, but spirit, memory, and faith. Historians still actively wrestle with how much of this reverence was purely practical versus entirely symbolic. Some argue it was purely survival instinct, simply dressed in custom. Others suggest fire was genuinely spiritual, a powerful force woven into cosmology and daily prayer. Perhaps both are true. Medieval people actively lived close enough to danger that fire naturally became more than fuel. It actively became meaning. Now vividly picture yourself in your imagined castle one last time. The bed curtains are securely drawn, blankets successfully piled high. Outside the wind aggressively lashes the towers. Snow persistently hisses against shutters, and the night intensely presses in with all its weight. But inside the great hearth, embers still glow, their faint light successfully slipping through cracks in the curtains. You close your eyes, clearly hearing the low sigh of flames, intrinsically knowing they are the thin line holding the frost at bay. The sensory experience is complete. The taste of smoke still persistently on your tongue. The weight of wool and fur across your chest. The warmth of a dog, successfully curled at your feet. The whisper of a prayer successfully echoing in your head. You gently drift toward dreams, intrinsically knowing that sleep in the Middle Ages was never entirely easy, never entirely assured, but always actively fought for with every trick, ritual, and fragment of warmth available. In the end, castles served as fortresses against men, but absolutely never against winter. What truly saved their inhabitants was not entirely stone or steel, but inherent resilience, invention, and community. To successfully survive the night meant actively layering blankets, sharing heat, burning fuel, and clinging to hope. Aggressively against the endless chill of the medieval night, humanity itself became the true fire. Now intentionally let the pace soften. Imagine the embers successfully glowing faintly, their light no longer fierce, but gentle, much like coals resting after long labor. The chamber is completely quiet, the rush of wind beyond the walls, successfully fading to a distant murmur. You actively feel the weight of blankets, heavy and intentionally protective, actively pressing you down into the mattress. The struggle of cold, the vigilance of fires, the noise of dogs and servants. All of it actively recedes as though you have successfully drawn a curtain across the world. Your breathing successfully slows. Each inhale actively tastes faintly of smoke and wool. Each exhale gently drifts into the still air. The sounds that once intensely echoed, boots on stone, shutters rattling, monks chanting, are now mere memories softened into whispers. The castle itself noticeably seems to sleep, its heavy stones successfully holding silence like a promise. Picture yourself safe within your cocoon. The dog at your feet sighs and gently shifts. The last candle gently gutters out, and darkness entirely folds around you like another blanket. The cold is still there, yes, but you no longer actively fight it. You peacefully accept it as those before you did, intrinsically knowing that sleep is a fragile truce. With the night, your body successfully grows heavier. Thoughts slowly dissolve into shapes and colors. The medieval world, with all its persistent chill and smoke, successfully becomes distant, much like frost melting in sunlight. What entirely remains is only calm. You are warm enough, safe enough, tired enough. And so the story successfully closes. The hearth gently flickers, the bed successfully holds you, and the long night successfully carries you gently into dreams. Rest now as they once did, entirely wrapped in quiet resilience. Sweet dreams.